If you've ever traveled overseas, you've almost certainly done so by airplane. But 50 years ago, international air travel was still only for the wealthy elite. But 3 men had a vision to change that and stitch the world together through widely available air travel for the average person. To do so, they would have to build an impossibly large jet, more than 2.5 times larger than anything that existed at the time.
Yeah, and this was truly a massive jet. I mean, just to give you an idea, this thing could carry over 650 passengers. It had a takeoff weight of almost 1 million pounds, and it was so big that Boeing had to build the largest building in the world just to construct it.
But the story of how it was built and the impact it's had on the world is also just as amazing. Boeing literally bet the company on the 747 and came close to bankruptcy trying to actually build it. And the success of the 747 created the world of affordable international travel that we know today.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This is Project Blueprint, the stories of legendary projects and the leaders behind them.
Stephen, to kick us off today, I wanted to start with a question. And it's a pretty broad question, but how do you build something that changes the world? Just overcoming the laws of physics to create something that's never been done before is a huge challenge. And a project of that scale usually is only possible with the resources of a massive organization. But for me, the flip side of that coin is that a large organization often creates a massive bureaucratic burden. And that's exactly the problem that Boeing faced in creating the 747. The engineering challenges of building the largest plane in the world were enormous, and they could only be accomplished with a massive organization of designers, builders, accountants, test pilots, and more. But how do you accomplish a world-changing project like this without succumbing to the necessary bureaucracy? So, Stephen, I'm going to make the argument that it all comes down to the leader. And not just that, but I'm going to borrow a phrase from Jeff Bezos and say that you need a leader who is stubborn on the vision, but flexible on the details.
Yeah, in general, I agree with this. I think that the only way to efficiently deliver through a bureaucracy is very strong leadership at the top. So very excited to hear how this transpires for Boeing.
Our story starts with just such a leader. Back in 1921, in the remote Pacific Northwest, Joe Sutter is born in Seattle, Washington. Now, growing up in the Pacific Northwest, Sutter developed a love for nature. He spent hours watching the bald eagles, ospreys, and red-tailed hawks fly, and he developed a fascination with flight. He also grew up in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, and the edge of his backyard overlooked the Boeing Aircraft Company's test flight field. Now, at the time, Boeing was the largest employer in Seattle, and many of Sutter's neighbors actually worked in the Boeing factory. And from his backyard, Sutter watched the test flights of some of Boeing's earliest commercial aircraft, like the Boeing 247 and the Stratoliner. And Sutter decided he wanted to become an airplane designer one day. But not just any airplane designer. Sutter's dream was to design a passenger airplane that could connect the world. So, Stephen, one of the primary sources I used in my research for the 747 was actually Sutter's own autobiography entitled 747, and I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a great book, but I wanted to quote from Sutter in the opening part of his book. "My friends all wanted to fly airplanes, but I set my heart on designing them. The futuristic flying machines I sketched as a boy would carry passengers in safety and comfort to the far continents, conquering oceans in a single flight." Now, little did Sutter know he would eventually be given the opportunity to make this dream a reality. But to accomplish something as grand as building an airplane to unite the world through air travel, Sutter will face enormous challenges. He'll have to overcome not just the physical problems of getting the largest plane in the world to fly, but also break through Boeing's entrenched bureaucracy. And to do this, he will have to learn to be stubborn on his vision, but flexible on the details. So Joe Sutter grew up watching these Boeing test flights from his own backyard, and one particularly tragic test flight made an important impression on him early on. So in 1939, Boeing's latest commercial airliner prototype, the Model 307 Stratoliner, broke apart in the air during a test flight, killing everyone on board, including several of Boeing's key designers. So actually, as Sutter watched the Stratoliner take off for the first time, he suspected that the tail looked a little too small. And his suspicion was confirmed when he saw the next prototype after the accident had been redesigned with a larger tail. And ultimately, Sutter learned that the crash was likely caused by an uncontrolled tail flutter during a steep climb. And so Sutter had two thoughts about this incident. First, it stoked his curiosity in airplane design and reinforced this intuition he had that a well-designed airplane should look right. It should feel natural to him. It also, really importantly, inspired a lifelong commitment to safety in his designs. And he says in his book, quote, "I vowed that the airplanes I would someday create would be as safe as human minds could possibly make them."
So I get the impression that a lot of passion for airplanes and airplane safety is instilled in Sutter from an early age.
Now, after Sutter graduated high school, he followed his dream and studied aeronautical engineering at the University of Washington. But World War II broke out while he was in college, and so he was commissioned as an officer in the Navy. And he wanted to work in naval aviation, but was actually assigned to a destroyer ship. Actually, Stephen, for his first Navy assignment, him and his wife traveled from Seattle to Miami, but they went by train because at the time, air travel wasn't ubiquitous, and so it took him 5 days total, and the last 3 days of this trip had no sleeper cabin, so they were just sitting on the train for 3 days straight to get from Chicago all the way down to Miami.
No kidding, 5 days. That really shows you how much of a luxury we have today.
Yeah, we think it's a little bit inconvenient to have to be on a plane for 4 hours or so to go from New York to LA. But this trip was 5 days of just sitting on a loud, noisy train.
Oh, that's incredible.
I'm certain it inspired Sutter to one day build a plane that would make air travel widely available for everyone. Sutter served in the Navy during World War II, and his service as an officer provided him with some critical training in leadership and teamwork. After the end of the war, Sutter finally got his chance to pursue his dream of designing a passenger airplane when he was hired into the aerodynamics group at Boeing. And interestingly here, Stephen, Sutter actually initially accepted a job at Douglas, the rival airplane manufacturer, because they were the dominant commercial aircraft designer at the time. But before he went down to California to take his job at Douglas, he took just a short summer job at Boeing. And so while he was at Boeing, he saw the work they were doing on some of the new jet engines and the new jet airplanes, and he realized that Boeing was the most exciting place to be if you're going to be an airplane designer. So Joe Sutter's first project was working on the successor to the Stratoliner, the plane he saw crash, and this was the Model 377 Stratocruiser. Now, this was a piston-engine commercial aircraft, and it was actually one of Boeing's first attempts at commercial aviation after World War II. But at the time, like I mentioned, jet engines were the next big thing. So most of the senior engineers at Boeing were focused on this jet technology, and the Stratocruiser was kind of a dead end. But this was actually a lucky break for Sutter because he was given more responsibility than would be typical for a junior engineer on another project. And so he gained some rare experience in integrating a total design, not just working on one small piece of the airplane, but putting it all together to create a complete aircraft. And Sutter described this experience as, quote, "one of the great learning experiences of my life." He had several opportunities to actually ride along on the test flights, and he was even sent to Tokyo right after the war to observe how military operations used the cargo variant of the Stratocruiser. Now, after the Stratocruiser, Sutter did get his first opportunity to work on designing a new jet aircraft. He worked on the 367-80 prototype that ultimately led to the 707, and he gained valuable experience in this new field of commercial jet design. He then went on to lead the FAA certification for the 707, which gave him further appreciation for the importance of safety. Now, Stephen, I think this is a good point to talk a little bit about what the commercial airline industry was like that Sutter's now designing jets for. In the late 50s and early 60s, Boeing's success with the 707 had ushered in a new age of jet air travel. It was faster, cheaper, and more comfortable than the old propeller aircraft. And Boeing had also introduced several successful variants of the 707. They had the 727, which was a smaller airplane for medium-haul domestic flights. They had the 737, an even smaller plane for short-range flights in small airports. And the 7 series of commercial aircraft established Boeing as one of the world's premier aircraft manufacturers. At this time, they had this reputation for quality and innovation. And there's this interesting phrase from the period that, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going. But the dream of air travel was still only a dream for most people. Despite the success of the 707, air travel still remained relatively expensive. So, Stephen, a round-trip ticket from New York to London on one of the 707 jets cost about $4,500 in 2025 dollars. So that's probably about the equivalent of a first-class ticket today, maybe a bit more, but that obviously means it's out of reach for most people. And so people who could afford to travel by air were known as the jet set. And this became shorthand for the wealthy and the beautiful and people who still wore suits and dresses when they flew. And, really to me, it's the equivalent of like flying on a private jet today. But by 1965, this was quickly changing. After the introduction of the 707 in 1958, international air travel had grown at a rate of 15% per year. And so in just this short period of time, the number of air travelers had doubled. But as the demand for air travel increased, it was quickly becoming apparent that the 707 was going to be too small. Now, by 1965, Boeing President Bill Allen was at the height of his power. He had gambled and won on this ambitious bet to introduce the world's first jet, the 707, and it helped him beat out his rival Douglas to control the commercial airliner market. It was also a great time for Allen to be leading an American aerospace company. Stephen, at this time, the U.S. was only 2 years away from putting a man on the moon, and Boeing had several of these lucrative contracts for the Apollo program, including the first stage of the Saturn V rocket. Boeing was also at this time working on a revolutionary new supersonic jet known as the Supersonic Transport, or SST. And the goal of this was to challenge the British and French Concorde for the supersonic commercial airliner market. The unprecedented growth in air travel also means that business is booming for Pan American World Airways, also known as Pan Am. And in the 1960s, Pan Am was the world's largest and most important international airline. The blue Pan Am Globe logo was one of the most iconic logos of the time, similar to the Nike swoosh or the McDonald's arches are today. And with the rise in jet travel, Pan Am's forecast predicted another 200% increase in the number of air travelers over the next 15 years. And the increased speed and passenger payload of the jets had also created a 4 to 5 times increase in per-plane productivity over the old propeller airliners. So Stephen, Pan Am is doing very well. This is their golden age. And they had just opened their new headquarters building in New York City above Grand Central Terminal that was the largest office building in the world at the time.
That's an incredible statistic, a 4 to 5x increase in productivity per airplane.
Yeah, we talked about this a lot on the 707 episode, but the reduced maintenance cost for the jet engines and then also the ability to fly much more quickly and do more trips with the same aircraft was a huge productivity unlock for Pan Am. So Pan Am was the king of international air travel, and one trip was the king of Pan Am. He had founded it in 1927 using island-hopping seaplanes to stitch together some of the first intercontinental flights across the Caribbean and Pacific. And he's really well known for his forceful personality and authoritarian-style leadership. Unlike other airline executives, Tripp didn't react to changes in demand. He was the one to create it. And he had this clear vision of the future where everyday people could fly across the oceans on a Pan Am airliner. And he has this great quote, Stephen, that I think sums up his entire purpose and goal with Pan Am. The true objective is to bring to the life of the average man those things which were once the privilege of the fortunate few. And Juan Trippe lived up to this vision. He introduced some of the first tourist class or economy tickets ever on commercial airliners. And he also believed in this idea of peace through tourism, the idea that shrinking the world through air travel would make the world a more peaceful place and actually offset the growing threat of nuclear weapons.
I really love what he says here about sort of bringing products and services to the masses. It's really cool to see that he has this vision.
Yeah, I love this idea, and it really lays out the purpose for the 747. So Juan Trippe has this vision, but he quickly realized he simply does not have enough seats in his existing fleet to meet the growing customer demand. And so the simplest solution would be to just fly more planes. And this explains the success of the 707, where about 1,000 planes were produced. But more airplanes create more congestion at the major airport hubs. And at the time, airport overcrowding was actually a serious concern as more and more of these planes were needed to meet the growing demand. The next solution Trippe considered was to increase the length of existing jets to allow for more seats. And aircraft manufacturer Douglas actually did this. They were able to increase the passenger capacity on their first jet, the DC-8, by more than double when they stretched it by 36 feet. But Trippe's ultimate solution to the demand problem is a supersonic transport jet known as the SST. But the development of this new technology is not going to be ready for some time. So Juan Trippe began pressuring Boeing President Bill Allen to design a sort of stopgap, a new elongated or double-decker jet that could meet his needs until the SST is ready.
Okay, so Juan Trippe is betting that the future of air travel is supersonic. And so he's only asking for an intermediate airplane to just bridge the gap.
Yeah, he knows the supersonic transport is going to take a while because it's an untested technology. And so he's thinking about what can I do in the meantime to meet this demand problem until I can get an even faster jet.
And I'm imagining that the sort of mindset at the time that everyone was thinking things were going to go supersonic.
Yeah, that was basically the industry expectation. So to meet Trippe's demands, Bill Allen first considered stretching the 707, just like Douglas had. But unfortunately for him, the 707 could not be stretched just as easily. And this is because the landing gear did not have enough clearance to prevent the tail from scraping on takeoff if the jet was stretched too much longer. And the 707 would require an expensive redesign of the landing gear, the wings, and the fuselage if Bill Allen wanted to stretch it. Ultimately, the story here is that Boeing had reached the point of diminishing returns for the 707, and it was time for something new. Now, in the summer of 1965, Bill Allen and Juan Trippe went on a fishing trip together in Alaska. And during this vacation, Juan Trippe told Bill Allen his two visions for the future of air travel. The first was a supersonic transport that would further reduce travel times and shrink the world. The second was a giant subsonic jet made possible by a new jet engine then in development. It would be 2.5 times larger than any airplane in existence, with reduced seat mile cost to relieve the strain of passenger demand until the supersonic transport was ready. Allen and Trippe discussed the benefits of this giant jet, and eventually Trippe said, "If you build it, I'll buy it." And Allen responded, "If you buy it, I'll build it." And so Trippe signed a letter of intent for Pan Am to buy 25 giant new jets from Boeing's first production run.
This seems like a very risky bet for both parties here.
Yeah, absolutely. For Bill Allen, he made this ridiculous promise to deliver the jet by the end of 1969, which was only 4 years away for design, testing, and manufacturing.
Oh, no kidding.
And it would be the world's largest plane. It would require all new technology. And also, no other airlines had expressed interest in a plane of this size. Juan Trippe was the only customer. But then Juan Trippe was also taking a bet too. 25 of these big jets had an estimated cost of $18 million each, for a total of $450 million, which would make this the largest commercial aircraft order in history. And interesting to me, Stephen, Pan Am's profit in 1965 was $50 million, So Tripp is basically leveraging 9 years of profits on this order.
Yeah, so I get the sense he's really going all in on this idea.
Yeah, I mean, him and Allen are both risk takers, and they were both visionaries who had already started the jet age with their calculated gamble on the 707. So to me, they saw this bigger jet and the SST both as the next necessary steps in Tripp's vision of bringing air travel to the common person. After this famous fishing trip, Allen decides to commission a design study for the giant jet to fulfill Tripp's need. And this is basically a study to determine the initial requirements for the jet, the configuration, and if it's going to be feasible before Boeing fully commits to building this jet. But Allen faces an interesting question. Who should lead this new project? The two best engineers at Boeing at the time capable of leading this type of project were Maynard Pennell and Jack Steiner. And they were actually both lead engineers on the 707 development. Maynard Pennell was the former Douglas employee who had come to Boeing and was one of the first to advocate for Boeing developing a commercial airliner that became the 707. But now, Pennell was working on the hottest new project, the supersonic transport. So that left Jack Steiner. He had also worked with Pennell on the 707, and afterwards had successfully developed the 727, and then poured his heart into the latest 7 Series commercial airliner, the 737, planned to be an even smaller airplane for these short-range flights and small airports. But unfortunately for Steiner, Douglas had actually gotten the jump on Boeing in the short-range airliner market with their new DC-9. And Steiner was unable to sell the 737 to any airline except a small number of launch orders to German airliner Lufthansa. Bill Allen wasn't impressed with the initial orders for the 737, and he refused to commit to production without any more commitments from other airlines. But for Steiner, he was worried his successful career might suddenly come to a halt if the 737 didn't make it into production. Undeterred, Steiner went above Bill Allen's head and secretly lobbied members of Boeing's board of directors. He argued the Lufthansa orders were sufficient to launch production for the 737.
No kidding.
So typically, the board would defer to Bill Allen on these major decisions, but Steiner was able to convince them that Boeing would lose the regional jet market to Douglas if the 737 was abandoned. So the board outvoted Allen and ordered the 737 into production.
I mean, that's so amazing to me, though, that he goes above his head here. I mean, surely that must have soured their relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. As you can imagine, Allen was livid when he found out that Steiner had gone over his head to influence the board of directors. And he actually considered firing Steiner, but he held back ultimately because Steiner was a valuable engineer who had been successful on the 707 and the 727 projects. But when it comes to this giant new jet for one trip, Allen remembers this slight and decides to pass over on Steiner.
So that almost leaves Bill Allen with sort of a blank slate to start from here to go find someone to lead the new large aircraft program.
Yeah, that's right. You know, his two best engineers are either busy or, in Steiner's case, out of favor, and he needs someone else with the experience to lead this last big gamble of his.
So to summarize, we have this guy, Joe Sutter, and he basically grew up watching airplanes because Boeing was in his backyard. It was sort of his dream to become an airplane designer and hopefully one day build a passenger jet of his own. Allen and Tripp are looking for one last gamble to realize Tripp's vision of uniting the world through air travel. We have the sort of famous trip to Alaska where Tripp shares his idea of a new giant jet that will help meet the explosive demand for air travel, and Allen famously agrees to the challenge by saying, "If you buy it, I'll build it."
But now Allen needs to pick someone to lead this new project for a giant jet. Pennell is busy with the SST, Steiner has fallen out of grace after his stunt with the 737, but Bill Allen has another name in mind, a relatively junior engineer who has exactly what Allen thinks this giant jet will need to become a reality. Joe Sutter had played his own part in launching the jet age with his work on the 707. And after the launch and success of the 707, Sutter was moved under Jack Steiner. Under Steiner, Sutter worked on the 727 and then the 737. And while working on the 737, Sutter earned this reputation as a hard-nosed realist who followed the tradition of seeing the airplane as a whole rather than constraining his expertise to any one single detail. But by 1965, working under Steiner on the 737 makes Sutter, who is now 43 years old, feel like he's once again been condemned to this unimportant backwater project, just like the Stratocruiser before. Because the most exciting project at Boeing right now was the supersonic transport.
Yeah, I would imagine like if I was him at this time, everyone was talking about the supersonic age. So it's completely understandable that he felt working on this smaller regional jet that he felt sidelined.
Bill Allen decided that this giant new jet that he's working on for one trip needs someone who can really see the big picture and balance several competing interests at one time to make a big project like this a reality. And so Allen remembers an engineer on the 737 project named Joe Sutter who had come up with this clever idea for mounting the engines on that plane. So the 737 was planned as a response to Douglas's DC-9 for the small regional jet market, and the DC-9 had its engines mounted in the rear of that plane behind the wings because it was so short. But Sutter and his boss Steiner realized that this would be an issue if the design ever needed to be stretched, like was common. If it was stretched, the nose of the airplane would need to be longer to maintain the balance with the heavy engines at the rear. But then this would create another problem because most baggage cargo would now be forward of the wing and the plane would be unbalanced again. So Sutter solved this issue with a really unique idea to mount the engines directly beneath the wings instead of at the rear. And actually for this new design, he received a patent on the engine placement and a $50 reward from Boeing. But more importantly here, Sutter learned a valuable lesson during the design of the 737. And I'll quote from his book, "Never take the initial design configuration as a given. Engineers love to dive in and analyze the hell out of reams of data. Very often, though, they can't see the forest for the trees because they haven't done the simple work up front to be sure they're starting down the right path." So this is a key lesson to me here, Stephen, because Sutter's ability and insight here to balance the competing interest while also maintaining the larger focus on the broader design as a whole is going to make him an ideal candidate for Allen's new project.
Honestly, Will, I couldn't agree with Sutter here more. I do see this all the time at Amazon where engineers sort of obsess over minor details and they sort of lose focus on the bigger picture.
So after Tripp and Allen's famous fishing trip, in the summer of 1965, Joe Sutter is also on his own vacation. But he gets a call from Allen asking if he wants to lead the design study for the giant new jet they're calling the 747. Joe Sutter doesn't hesitate. He immediately agrees and says, quote, "This was precisely what I dreamed of ever since I was a kid."
Oh, good for him.
So this is a watershed moment for Sutter here, and he says, all he could think about during the vacation was starting this exciting new project. And so eventually he just gives up on the vacation and cuts it short because that's all he can think about. So what a great choice from Bill Allen here, too, to find somebody who is so excited about this new project that they're cutting their vacation short to get started.
Yeah, I think passionate people produce the best outcomes, and this is just what a great opportunity for Sutter. This is awesome. I'm actually got a little emotional when you said that quote.
But there's kind of one caveat. So Allen's call specifies that Sutter will lead the initial design study, but he doesn't make it clear who's going to lead the full design of the 747 project if it's funded. So this is going to be a test to see if Joe Sutter is up to the challenge.
So he's got to really deliver here.
This choice by Bill Allen is really interesting here. I think he made a great pick in picking someone who's so passionate, but from his perspective, he's also willing to take this risk on a relatively junior engineer because the 747 is not Boeing's number one priority at the time. So it was prioritized below other more important projects like the supersonic transport and the 737 and 727, which were already in production and had paying customers. At this time, Boeing was also developing the first stage for the Apollo program's Saturn V rocket. So they've got their plate full, and the 747 is just the next project in a long list that Boeing is working on. And actually, when the project first kicked off, most people at Boeing thought that the 747 would only be a paper airplane, or a plane that would be designed but never built. But there were also doubts, both inside and outside of Boeing, that a plane as large as the 747 could even fly. Remember, this is going to be 2.5 times larger than the 707, which is the biggest plane at the time. There's also no existing engine at the time powerful enough, and none of Boeing's factories are even large enough to produce a plane this big. To add to it, there's no customer in sight. Alan had this soft commitment, a verbal agreement from Tripp, but he knew Tripp, this shrewd negotiator, was also playing the field. He was trying to get Lockheed or Douglas to build this big jet for him also. But if the 747 is ultimately approved, it's going to be the single largest investment Boeing has ever made. Now, since the 747 is a low priority, Sutter kind of struggles to compete for resources from management when he first starts this design study. He starts out with a team of 100 engineers, but he struggled to pull enough engineers away from these other projects. And the engineers he did get kind of felt like they had been passed over for more exciting projects like the SST. So unsurprisingly, morale was low initially, and everyone thought they were just working on a paper airplane that would never fly. But Sutter let the team know that he valued their skills, and he did his best to project confidence that the plane would eventually be built.
I think it's so important that a leader in this situation maintains a lot of passion and confidence in the project.
Yeah, absolutely. If everyone on the team thinks the plane's never going to fly, and if Joe Sutter shares that opinion, it's probably never going to fly. It's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy because nobody's really going to try. But Joe Sutter also had other challenges for resources. The 747 program was last in line also for office space and facilities. So Joe Sutter and his team started out on the second floor of a metal parts stamping building in Renton, which was one of Boeing's smaller satellite offices near Seattle. And so every time a new part was stamped on the floor below, the engineers' drafting tables above would shake. So in contrast, though, the SST engineers were housed in a brand new development center. And it was this huge engineering building that was actually large enough to house a full-size mock-up of the SST. And at the time, Sutter thought that not being able to get the attention of senior management and these resources was a big disadvantage. But he says in his book, in hindsight, it was actually a blessing because his team had more autonomy and authority than was typical on a big project like this.
I agree with that. Having their desk in a metal stamping building, to me, that has a sort of scrappy kind of move fast startup.
It sounds like a startup culture kind of.
Yeah.
It's like they could be in a garage also.
Right. Like to me, it's almost an advantage.
So despite these challenges, Sutter is really excited to kick off what promises to be his chance to realize his childhood dream of designing a commercial airliner of his own. The first step in making the 747 a reality was this design study to determine what Boeing called the performance requirements. And this is basically just the targets the jet needs to meet in terms of range, payload, handling characteristics, etc. I think Sutter has a really interesting approach on how he's going to tackle this problem. And he says, quote, "The secret to success in any business is to properly define and meet customer requirements. It's all the more important in commercial aviation because jets are so enormously costly to develop that any mistakes carry heavy penalties." I think this is really interesting for anyone who listened to the 707 episode. This is kind of in stark contrast to what Boeing's weakness before was that they didn't listen to their customers at all.
Right.
But Sutter has learned this lesson. He's learned the lessons of the 707 program, and he's going to immediately start by listening to customers. So Sutter surveyed Pan Am and other airlines to determine how big of an aircraft they would need to meet this growing passenger demand. And after he talks to Pan Am and other customers, he realizes that they want this jet to transport over 350 passengers. For comparison, the 707 only had 140 passenger seats. So the 747 is going to be 2.5 times larger than any airplane in existence. And for Sutter and his ragtag team of engineers, this is kind of scary and a little bit sobering. They're in an entirely new region of airplane sizing. Another requirement Sutter identified early on is that Juan Trippe also wanted the 747 to be used as a cargo transport. So you remember his idea was that the supersonic aircraft was going to be the future, and he expected the 747 just to be a stopgap. And so he believed that in the future, all subsonic transport would eventually be used just for transporting cargo. So he wanted this optionality to be able to convert the 747 to cargo use once passengers started riding supersonic jets.
Oh, that's very interesting. So this means that this is a design not only for a passenger aircraft, but also a cargo aircraft.
Yeah, and it's going to have big implications on the design. Now, the other constraint that Sutter and his team are wrestling with is the short timeline. Juan Trippe and Pan Am wanted the plane delivered quickly to meet this growing customer demand for air travel. And Allen had, surprisingly, agreed to Trippe's demand to deliver the new jet by the end of 1969. So that only leaves 28 months to design an entirely new airplane from scratch. This is about 2/3 the amount of time normally allocated to develop a new jet at the time. And today, timelines for developing new jets are even longer. So this short timeline and urgency will set the tone for how Sutter approaches the entire project. Okay, Stephen, so now we're getting into the detailed design of what this 747 is going to look like. And this is a great story, so I'm excited to tell it. To start off, one of the most important decisions made in aircraft design is the cross-section. And that's basically the width of the fuselage and the passenger cabin. Planes can be modified in a variety of ways after they're designed. Like we talked about, they could be stretched. But the cost of modifying the cross-section, like the width of the airplane, is usually prohibitive because it requires complete changes to the wings, the support structure, and every other major system on the plane.
So the cross-section is basically a one-way door decision.
Absolutely. And Sutter, Allen, and others at Boeing remember how on the 707, they nearly lost the battle for the jet age to Douglas because the passenger cabin on the 707 was 3 inches too narrow. So Sutter has just one chance to get this right. At the time, ideas for very large airplanes were always double-deckers. So, unsurprisingly, the initial design for the 747 is a double-decker, and it's basically just 2 707 decks stacked on top of each other. And Juan Trippe had actually already made up his mind that he wanted a double-decker. He thought the name double-decker would be a great marketing slogan, and interestingly, Pan Am had also adopted this maritime motif for their seaplane service, and this continued into the jet age, and Juan Trippe called all of his planes these flying clipper ships, and they had captains, first officers, and stewards, and a lot of these names originated from maritime industry aboard ships. So what Trippe wanted was for the 747 to be like an aerial ocean liner with 2 rows of round porthole windows, kind of like a big ship.
Oh, okay.
But Sutter had this gut feeling that the double-decker wasn't actually the best design. He remembered the lesson he had learned on the 737's engines and this maxim to never take the initial design configuration as a given. He said, quote, "The 737 taught me to step back at the outset of any program and take a clear, simple look at the basic physical problems that need to be addressed."
Yeah, I agree. You know, when they started with the idea of a double-decker, that kind of smelled to me, right? Because a double-decker should be an outcome to solve a problem. You don't start with the outcome, right? So a double-decker might not actually be the best solution to the problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. So right off the bat, Sutter identifies several drawbacks to the double-decker design. For starters, passenger boarding and deplaning is going to be more complex because it has this second deck. You'll need dual-level jet bridges for passengers to get in, or a really steep set of stairs for people to access the second deck.
And it would require airports to basically redesign their parking spaces for these aircraft with double deckers.
Yeah, there's a big infrastructure change that would have to happen. Also, for the cargo version of the 747, it's going to be more complicated to load air freight onto 2 decks rather than just a single one. But most importantly to Sutter, it would be more difficult to evacuate passengers from the tall upper deck in the case of an emergency. Putting 350 plus passengers on a single plane, it creates this entirely new level of risk from an airplane design perspective. It's more than double the number of passengers any aircraft had ever been designed for. Sutter has this huge responsibility, and he takes it seriously. And so there's this requirement from the FAA that requires all passengers to be able to evacuate within 90 seconds. On a double-decker, this second deck would sit at a height of about 25 feet, which is almost the height of a 2-story house. So any passengers trying to evacuate in an emergency would face this really steep jump off of the evacuation slides. So this safety issue in particular bothers Sutter, and he's known for being ultra-conservative on these issues of safety.
Wow, yeah, I imagine this would really bother Sutter because going back to his childhood, he saw the Stratoliner take off and he thought to himself the tail was too small and that plane eventually crashed. And so I think safety's always been a part of his personality, and I don't think a double-decker is going to sit very well with him.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, Stephen, but I, for one, am really glad to know that someone as safety conscious as Joe Sutter is designing this airplane, because you're going to have more than 350 people on a single plane at once. It better be the most safe airplane that has ever flown before. Sutter doesn't like this idea of the double-decker, and he starts working with his engineers on countless different iterations of the 747's layout, but no configuration of the double-decker seems to be able to solve this critical passenger safety issue. And so, as Sutter's struggling with the configuration, Bill Allen weighs in, and I'll quote from Clive Irving's book, Jumbo. Word came down from Bill Allen re-emphasizing that if the 747 went ahead, all the family jewels would be tied up in it, that the engineers would have only one shot to get it right, and that included making the design as flexible and versatile as possible. So with this in mind, Sutter looked at the configuration one more time, focusing more on the freighter role of the 747. And as it so happened, at the time, a new international standard for shipping containers had just been published. And this included a standard height and width of 8 feet by 8 feet, with the goal here being to standardize shipping containers across road, rail, and cargo ship transportation. And so with this in mind, an engineer on Sutter's team drew 2 8-foot wide shipping containers side by side and then drew a circle around them. And so the resulting design was a fuselage much wider than any existing aircraft, almost twice as wide as the 707.
So it's 2 shipping containers placed side by side that ultimately defines the width of the fuselage?
So this is just an idea at first. Sutter performed this rapid study of a wider deck configuration to determine if it's going to be the superior design. And what he quickly realized was, 1, it's easier to load air freight on a single wide deck rather than 2. There's no difficulty evacuating the passengers from a tall second deck. And this wider body created more space in the cargo holds, even on the passenger versions. Another benefit was the passenger cabin would be so large, it would feel more like sitting in a room rather than being crammed in a tube. But there was one serious drawback. The wide-body design would be heavier than the double-decker because of the additional structural support required. But Sutter believed the advantages outweighed the disadvantages, and he decided on a fuselage wide enough for 2 standard shipping containers side by side, or 10 abreast economy seating with 2 aisles. And thus the wide-body airliner was born. So today, Stephen, wide-body refers to the class of double-aisle jumbo jets that were inspired by the 747. To this day, almost all long-haul international flights are on wide-body aircraft, and the 747 was the grandfather of all of them.
Wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that the 747 was the first aircraft to introduce the twin aisle design.
Yeah, so I think this is, one of the biggest contributions to aviation from the 747 is this idea that rather than it be a double decker, it's going to be a single wide body with two aisles. And for me, Stephen, this is the first sign that Sutter is the type of leader who could make the 747 a reality. Everyone at Boeing used the successful design of the 707 as the starting point because they thought the 707's cross-section was too good to consider changing. So they defaulted to a double-decker and just stacked two 707s on top of each other. But Sutter applied the lesson he had learned on the 737 to never take the initial design configuration as a given. And so, Stephen, this goes back to me to the biggest leadership principle here, to be stubborn on your vision, but flexible on the details. Sutter was stubborn on this vision for a large passenger and freighter aircraft, but he was flexible on the detail of the cross-section. He sought to solve the problem from first principles, and it really allowed him to see the bigger picture and develop a cross-section suited to the performance requirements instead of just a cross-section that everyone assumed was correct.
And this is part of the reason why Bill Allen hired him for this project, because he saw the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about this as kind of a test from Bill Allen to see if Joe Sutter is up to the task of leading this jet.
And I'm imagining this airplane, as designed at this point, is a single-deck aircraft with a very wide body.
So that's the design that Sutter wants to go with. But he's not going to have the final say. He'll have to convince first his team and then management that the wide body is the superior design.
So, to summarize, Bill Allen is looking for someone to lead the 747 program, and Joe Sutter sticks out to him because he's sort of established this reputation for being someone who can kind of see the big picture. It starts with just a design study because Allen doesn't have a signed contract from Tripp. And also the 747 is frankly a low priority compared to other projects like the SST and the other planes in production. So Sutter kicks off the project by engaging with customers, and he learns early on that this aircraft will need to transport at least 350 passengers, which sets the stage for a massive aircraft. Sutter's first breakthrough comes when designing the cross-section. He questions the conventional wisdom that the giant jet needs to be double-decker, and instead, he decides on a design for an incredibly wide passenger cabin, and thus the wide-body aircraft is born.
But it won't be that easy. Coming up with a good idea is only half the battle. But now, Sutter has to convince his team and management that the wide body is a winner. And in the bureaucratic world of Boeing, Sutter knows politics is bound to play a role. But what he doesn't know is it might cost him leadership of the project. Sutter's revelation that the 747's performance requirements could be achieved with a wide-body design was a masterstroke. But while he believed the wide-body would make for a better jet, he kind of struggles here to communicate this vision to his team. And actually, initially, Sutter's team pushed back on the idea for a wide-body. There's a couple reasons for this. First, they were under a tight deadline, and most of the engineers just wanted to get started with the design. They didn't want to mess around with rethinking the entire project. And then also, almost all of Sutter's team was actually older than him by a decade or more. A lot of the promising young talent at Boeing had been assigned to the supersonic transport, the SST. And so they were kind of reluctant to listen to someone who had never led an aircraft design before. And Joe Sutter is about to get his first taste of Boeing's bureaucracy, because the internal politics are not going to let the double-decker idea die. The first surprise for Sutter comes when the sales and marketing teams are shocked by the idea of giving up the double-decker. They felt that Boeing should deliver the double-decker because that was what Juan Tripp wanted. And they were worried Tripp would tear up the contract and get a competitor to build the double-decker for him if Boeing refused. But interestingly, Sutter also had to fight the inertia of Boeing's failed bid for the C-5 military cargo jet. So a little bit of background here, Stephen, on the C-5. Boeing had worked really closely with the Air Force to create this concept for a large transport jet that could airlift troops, tanks, and equipment anywhere in the world. And Boeing was so involved, they even helped write the budget paper to Congress to get the funding for this idea approved. So naturally, the engineers at Boeing expected to easily beat out their rivals Lockheed and Douglas for the contract because they had been involved from the beginning and objectively had the better design. But unknown to Boeing, the Air Force changed the design criteria at the last minute. And by the time the change was discovered, it was too late. Lockheed, however, had known of the change earlier and adapted their design. Bill Allen actually found out from Juan Tripp's Washington, D.C. lobbying network that even though the Boeing and Douglas designs for the C-5 were better, Lockheed was going to win. And so at first this doesn't make any sense, but there's a little bit of background that's important. It so happened that the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee that had a lot of say in whether this project got funded or not was a senator from Georgia. And so Lockheed was based in California, but as part of their bid for the C-5, they promised to build it at an old World War II plant in Marietta, Georgia. Because Bill Allen and Boeing were based in the low population state of Washington, Boeing didn't enjoy the same lobbying firepower as Lockheed. And so after this episode, Boeing's management is really tempted to start playing this political game to win government contracts rather than just focus on building great airplanes.
That's really unfortunate. What a broken government, it seems like.
Yeah, it just goes to show you how political some of these big airline contracts can be. But, obviously it's an example of just corrupt bureaucracy because ultimately the C-5 program ended up being a failure. It became the first military aircraft to produce a $1 billion cost overrun, and also the wings eventually developed cracks, leading to another $2 billion in redesign cost. And so the program was terminated after only producing 80 aircraft. Now, after Boeing lost the C-5 contract to Lockheed, there were about 100 engineers out of work. And these engineers became known as the Hungry 100 because there was no job for them in Boeing. One executive heard of Sutter's idea to get rid of the double-decker and decided to put an end to it. Boeing's C-5 design had actually also been a double-decker, so he sent the Hungry 100 over to the 747 project to put an end to Sutter's wide-body idea. And one ambitious engineer from the Hungry 100 actually tried to stage a coup and take Sutter's job as project lead. He suggested that since Sutter had such a great relationship with the airlines, Sutter should be the customer face of the program while he led the design of the plane. And this rogue engineer actually ordered engineers to start drawing double-decker designs again, and he even had them proceed with creating several scale wooden models of a double-decker 747.
So yeah, Sutter is fighting this two-front war. The first front being designing a great airplane, and the second front being fighting bad ideas.
Yeah, really here he's fighting the bureaucracy because he's come up with this great new idea for the wide body. He doesn't have much time to put together a wide body design before Tripp needs the final configuration for the jet. But actually he ends up working backwards because just when they think they're making progress on the wide body, this rogue engineer comes in and starts from square one working on the double-decker design. And it's really crazy to me that they built these wooden scale models. There's actually pictures you can see online. There's these scale models of a double-decker version of the 747.
So what was Sutter's kind of reaction to this rogue engineer?
Sutter didn't tolerate someone trying to steal his dream for a second. And he basically immediately gave management an ultimatum. And he said, there's only room for one director of engineering on the 747 program, and you've got to decide who that is. So immediately here, Sutter is such a believer in the wide-body design that he's willing to stake his job on it and basically say, if you don't give me full control of the program to design it how I want, you can pick somebody else.
So I get the sense that Sutter, in order to successfully execute on the 747 program, he's going to need to establish himself as the authority on the program, or else I fear he will continue to have to fight these battles not only on the initial design, but on things down the road as well.
So the double-decker versus wide-body argument is finally decided when Milt Heinemann comes out in favor of the wide-body design. Milt Heinemann was the successful engineer who had designed the revolutionary interior for the 707 jet. And he highlighted that the 747's wide body would really just be a scaled-up version of the 707's fuselage. And so Heinemann is not only able to see the merit in Sutter's idea, but critically, he's also able to tell the story of why it was better to the team and management. So ultimately, management deferred to Heinemann and decreed that the 747 would use the wide-body design. And this rogue engineer was assigned to the SST. Now, for the remaining engineers on the project, it's now absolutely clear that Sutter was single-minded in his vision for the 747, and there would be no confusion on who was in charge.
That's really interesting how you say that Heinemann was able to sort of tell the story of why it was better. That's such like a powerful trait for a leader to have.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if I'm Joe Sutter, I'm taking notes right now because he had this great idea on the wide body design, and it's really a revolutionary idea. And like we said, one of the defining characteristics of all modern airliners. But this hits on another critical leadership lesson that we've talked about in previous episodes too, and that's the importance of communicating your vision. In this example, Sutter remains stubborn about his vision. He doesn't bend on his idea for a wide body. He'd rather be fired as the project lead than build an inferior aircraft. But he needs to work on communicating this vision to his team and management. Fortunately, Milt Heinemann understands this and is able to help. Again, the big leadership takeaway for me is selling the idea is just as important as the idea itself. We kind of saw this again with the Empire State Building in that episode. It was not enough just to build the tallest building in the world. You had to sell that idea.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a great lesson.
So now the internal political battle over the wide body is over, but Sutter still has to convince one more person, and that's the customer, Juan Trippe. So the sales team debated on who should fly to New York and break the news to Juan Trippe that he's not going to be getting his double-decker. But this meeting with Trippe is going to be difficult because remember, he already has his mind set on the double row of porthole windows for his big aerial ocean liner. Joe Sutter is immediately disqualified because he's this hard-nosed engineer who believes really passionately that the wide body is the correct design. And so, correctly, the sales team doesn't trust him to be diplomatic when he breaks the news to Trippe. But Juan Trippe had loved Milt Heinemann's revolutionary design for the 707's interior. So management agreed to send Heinemann to Pan Am headquarters in New York to break this new design to Trippe.
I think that's really interesting to send Heinemann. And to me, it resonates as a good decision because Heinemann had already sort of earned trust with Juan Trippe.
Now, before leaving for New York, Heinemann devised a plan to win over the stubborn Juan Trippe. He brought along a 20-foot-long clothesline with him to show how wide the new cabin would actually be. So Heinemann arrived early to the meeting room and measured the width of the room using this clothesline, and surprisingly, the room was almost exactly as wide as the proposed passenger cabin. So Heinemann kicks off this meeting with Trippe, and he breaks the news that Boeing plans to pivot from the double-decker design to a wide body. And the atmosphere immediately becomes tense. Trippe and his engineers were upset to hear that Boeing wanted to do away with his idea for the double-decker. But Heinemann pulled out the clothesline and showed that the interior of the jet would be as wide as the large conference room and 9 feet tall. He explained the circular fuselage would be so large that the walls would be more straight than curved. And so at this point, Trippe and his engineers were caught off guard because the proposed cabin would be double the width of any airliner before. But Trippe isn't quite won over yet. He agreed to see a mock-up of the wide body and the double-decker side by side before making his final decision.
I feel like that sort of visual is just really impactful to people. If you can visually show and let them experience it in person.
But Sutter and his team don't have time to wait for a decision from Tripp. They're already behind schedule. So, without waiting for Tripp to confirm the configuration, Sutter and his team started to design on a wide-body layout, and in less than a month, they had refined the idea into a definite design. Bill Allen had initially committed to Juan Tripp that he would complete the design study by March of 1966. But Sutter and his team were already behind, and the deadline slipped 1 month. So Tripp pressured Allen, reminding him how important it was that Pan Am take delivery before the end of 1969. And Allen responded with a bet. If Boeing wasn't building the 747 in 5 months, he would pay Tripp $10 million.
Holy smokes. But, this is like another gentleman's bet, right? Similar to like the original soft agreement to buy 25 of the airplanes. This is not contractually obligated.
Yeah, so, Allen and Tripp are just going back and forth here, but it's kind of this gentleman's agreement, but also this tense relationship because Allen knows at any time Juan Tripp could pull out of this agreement. So Joe Sutter continued with his design study and developed the 747 passenger and freighter versions in parallel. After seeing the design wide enough for 2 shipping containers next to each other, Pan Am's engineers were really excited about the cargo version of the 747. They wanted the 747 to have a hinged front nose for front-end loading, because front-end loading is the best solution for a freighter. You can load cargo straight in rather than through a side door, and it's a lot faster and more efficient. The problem is, with the hinged door on the front, where are they going to put the cockpit? So Sutter's team played around with the idea, and they drew up a design to place the cockpit above the main deck. And this would free up more space for passengers or cargo on the main deck, and also allowed for a hinged front nose on the cargo variations.
So this is where we get the sort of distinctive hump that you have on the 747, that distinctive second upper deck just at the front of the airplane.
Yeah, so anyone who's familiar with the 747, you can usually point it out easily because it's basically a 2-story airplane at the very front. So it has this tall hump, and then it tapers down towards the back of the airplane.
And I imagine if they didn't have this cargo version requirement, the 747 might have looked a lot more like the 777 instead of having this 2-story design.
So after Milt Heineman's presentation to Juan Tripp on the wide-body idea, Tripp decided to visit Seattle to tour mock-ups of the double-decker and wide-body designs side by side. So this is kind of funny here, Stephen. When Juan Tripp comes to Seattle to tour these mock-ups, Joe Sutter and his engineers intentionally put this rickety set of wooden stairs leading up to the second deck of the double-decker. And so seeing the extreme height in person made Tripp kind of reconsider his preference for this tall upper deck.
Oh, that's so funny. That's sort of using this psychological tactic to get him to hopefully commit to the wide-body version is so interesting.
Next, Tripp and his engineers inspected the huge main deck of the wide-body design, and they're surprised because it's much bigger than any passenger cabin they'd ever seen before. Then, Sutter led Tripp up a sturdier set of stairs to the flight deck on the wide-body mock-up. Tripp gets up there, he's looking around the cockpit, and he sees this area behind the cockpit in the hump of the 747. And so he asks, what is this for? And one of the Pan Am engineers says, we're thinking about using this for a crew rest area. And Tripp, in his characteristic manner, he barks, "Rest area? This is going to be reserved for passengers." And so with this comment, Sutter and Allen realized that Tripp has agreed to the wide-body design.
Yeah, he's in.
And back on the ground, he even tells Sutter, you made the right decision. But what's funny to me here, Stephen, is that the 747 was kind of a double-decker, because it does have a second deck.
Yeah.
And I can just imagine Tripp thinking okay, I'm just going to ride on the second deck and imagine that I'm on my double-decker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I think there's a valuable lesson to learn there, too, because it kind of makes Tripp's decision easier by allowing him to save face a little bit. They didn't try to, embarrass him and show him what a bad idea the double-decker was. It's hey, we do kind of have a double-decker, but we're also going to give you this wide cabin. So it's yes and rather than no but.
Right, exactly.
So after his approval for the wide-body design, Tripp signed the purchase agreement for 25 747s at $18 million apiece. Or in 2025 dollars, that would be about $180 million each. And for Joe Sutter, Tripp's approval of the wide-body design improved his reputation from this young, unproven engineer to someone who was respected within the company and trusted to define the vision for the 747. So ultimately, Bill Allen decided Sutter would remain engineering director for the next phase of full design.
Okay, so they're bringing him on full-time, and Sutter also sort of critically establishes himself as the leader of the project within the company. So hopefully you'll get less of this pushback against decisions.
Oh, Stephen, if that were only the case. So there's kind of a caveat here. So, with Sutter surviving that coup from the Hungry 100 for control of the 747 engineering team, now this decision from Juan Tripp to embrace his idea of the wide body, Sutter has really consolidated his position as engineering director. But it gets a little bit complicated because now that the 747 is going to be a contracted airplane, it's going to be a huge project. It's not just this initial design study. It's going to be building a factory. It's going to be sales and marketing. And it's also going to be the airplane design. So Sutter, as engineering director, is going to be responsible for the design of the aircraft, arguably the most important part of the project. But he's going to have a couple layers of management between him and Bill Allen that oversee the entire 747 program. So his days of fighting the Boeing bureaucracy are not quite over yet.
So to kind of summarize here, Joe Sutter finds himself fighting for leadership of the 747 program, and the double-decker design versus wide-body is a contentious issue. He struggles to sort of communicate this idea to not only his team, but management as well. But he's able to win over interior designer Milt Heineman, who realizes the benefits of the wide-body. Heineman is able to convince management that the wide-body is the superior design, and he travels to New York City to sell the idea to Juan Tripp. Tripp ends up agreeing with Joe Sutter and Milt Heineman that the wide body is the superior design. And Pan American Airlines signs the contract for the first deliveries of the 747, and it is officially a funded program.
But unlike the 707, Boeing will not be competing directly with a rival like Douglas. Instead, Joe Sutter will be up against the physical constraints of building the world's largest jet, the financial burden of Bill Allen's biggest gamble yet, and, worst of all, Boeing's internal politics and bureaucracy. So, Stephen, the 747 was really actually three massive programs at once. It was designing the airplane, which we've talked about, but it was also building a factory for the airplane and developing the engines. So, let's talk a little bit about the factory that they're going to have to construct to build an airplane this massive. The 747 was so large that no existing factory in the world was big enough to build it. So, Boeing would have to build an entirely new factory just for this new jet. And to put in perspective how big of a factory they're going to need, a 747 has a wing area equivalent to a parking lot for 45 cars. And its tail is as high as a 6-story building. So they're going to need a massive factory just to have enough space to assemble something like this. So Bill Allen begins the process of site selection for this new factory, and for him, the location of the factory offers an opportunity for some political patronage. Because a factory of this size is going to offer any state a lot of taxes, well-paying jobs, and these huge construction contracts. And Allen remembered how Boeing had lost the C-5 contract after Lockheed's promise to build that plane in Georgia. So some senior management at Boeing began advocating for building the factory in California, where it would benefit from not only a skilled pool of labor from the high-tech tech industries near Lockheed and Douglas, but more importantly, California was the second most populous state in the country and enjoyed much more political clout in Washington, D.C. But Seattle has always been home for Boeing, even when it was effectively in the middle of nowhere. So Allen is also considering a site 30 miles north of Seattle in the old lumber mill town of Everett. The Everett site had lower land values and taxes. It was also connected to a nearby interstate and railway, and it was also, importantly, the hometown of both of Washington State's senators. But one of the drawbacks is the site was so covered in clay and gravel that it would require a significant amount of earthwork just to create a level site for the factory.
If they go with Everett, though, they're giving up the political brownie points of selecting a different state or city.
Yeah, so it's this tough choice for Bill Allen because on one hand, Seattle is Boeing's home, and they've been there forever. They're a big part of the local community. Actually, at this point, Boeing accounts for 20% of Seattle's economy. But there's also one more critical consideration. And when Joe Sutter is asked for his input, he bluntly tells the planning committee that locating the factory outside of Seattle would be an unmitigated disaster. Because he knew that separating the design and production of the 747 would delay the schedule and ultimately create an inferior airplane. So there's this other dimension of if they put this factory in California, what's it going to be like if the designers are in Seattle, but production's in California? They're going to be spread thin.
You want the designers to be as close to the assembly line as possible to create a superior product, I think, in manufacturing.
Yeah, so that's definitely the perspective from the product side. But again, this doesn't occur in a vacuum. And so there's also these political considerations that Sutter's going to have to deal with. Sutter has a great quote on how he approaches this. He says, quote, "As I saw it, I wasn't doing my job if I didn't speak my convictions and voice important truths, however impolitique." So ultimately, despite the benefits of California, Allen was also nearing the end of his career, and he didn't want one of his last acts as president to be an investment outside of Washington. So Allen decided to build the factory in Everett. Once Allen decided on a site for the factory, the effort to build the factory itself was massive, almost as involved as building the airplane itself. So they selected this site. It was 780 acres, which for reference, Disneyland, California is only 500 acres. So this is a massive site. And they needed to move about 4 million cubic yards of dirt just to create a level site for the factory. Just to put that in context, you'd need about 400,000 dump truck loads to move that much dirt. To build this factory, construction started immediately in June of 1966 so that they could keep Allen's $10 million promise to Juan Trippe that they would start building the 747 by August. But even on an accelerated schedule, they realized the first 747s would have to be assembled while the factory was still being built around them before the roof was even in place.
No kidding, wow.
And in this Seattle fall season, it rained for 66 days straight, and construction ran $5 million over budget just to shore up all this mud on site. But despite these challenges, the construction crews completed the first phase in just 6 months. The completed factory today is still used to produce most of Boeing's wide-body jets, like the 767, 777, and 787, and it is the largest building on Earth by volume. The Boeing Everett factory has floor space equivalent to 75 football fields, and the 11-story high ceiling is so tall that clouds sometimes form inside.
Interesting. So then they repurposed the building later for the 777 and the 787 and so on.
Yeah, it's still used to this day to build all of Boeing's wide-body aircraft, and over time it's grown even larger. Joe Sutter's first order of business, now that the full design for the 747 has started, is one of the most critical parts of an airplane, the wing. Once Sutter and his team decided on the general configuration of the wing, the detailed design began. And the wing would actually go on to consume most of Sutter's time on the project. So his engineers estimated it would take a combined 15,000 hours of wind tunnel time to design this large wing. So to meet the tight deadline, Sutter spread teams across the country in 8 different wind tunnels to perform the wing test. But still, engineers struggled to balance the forces in the wing. The wing failed to behave accordingly to their calculations, and it wouldn't fly. Even more worrying, the wing was susceptible to flutter. Flutter, for anyone who doesn't know, is this dangerous condition where the natural vibration of one part of the plane's structure combines with another vibration to create this mutually reinforcing harmonic resonance. And this is basically just these violent vibrations in the plane that at certain speeds can literally shake an airplane apart.
Holy smokes. This doesn't sound good.
And to make matters worse, Joe Sutter's old boss, Jack Steiner, who was working on the 737, got wind of the troubles with the 747's wing.
Oh boy.
After being passed over by Bill Allen for leadership of the 747 program, Jack Steiner was eager for an opportunity to take over this project and put his name on another Boeing jet. He decided this was his chance. So Steiner exaggerates this wing issue and escalates it to management. Management decides that this issue called for an engineering audit. So Stephen, this is a really interesting process here. So this engineering audit is a unique process at Boeing where basically management assembled a second engineering team in parallel to assess the issue and take over if needed. The plan here is that Sutter and his engineers will continue trying to design a wing that would work. At the same time, a rival team led by Steiner would also try to design a new wing. The best design would be chosen for the final wing, and if Sutter loses out, his position as engineering director might be at risk once again.
My take is this. If there are genuine wing issues that the team is not competent enough to solve, then maybe they should step in. But if this is just some political power game and he's using the wing as sort of a tool to take over the program, then this is just counterproductive. And it kind of gets under my skin a little bit, to be honest, because it's bad for the program and it doesn't result in great products for customers ultimately. So this whole maneuver just bothers me.
Yeah, so let's see what ultimately happens. Steiner smelled blood in the water, and he wasted no time with this opportunity. Over the weekend, he moved into the same building as Sutter's team, occupied an auditorium, tore out the seats, and installed drafting tables for 50 engineers that he had hijacked from the SST program. And they go to work on a wing to beat out Sutter. And so now Steiner is obsessed with this idea of winning against Sutter. He described his mission to this hastily assembled group of engineers as, quote, "You call yourself a black parachutist. You drop in at night and cut your way through a wall of human flesh." So he's just kind of being a bit crazy here, in my opinion. And so he explains to his team of engineers that they only had 2 months to finish the new wing design, so they would need to work day and night to design a completely new wing. At the same time, Steiner also decided that the nose design wasn't optimized and decided to take a shot at redesigning that too. So eventually, Steiner and his team decided the solution for the wing was to give it a slight twist along the entire length from the fuselage to the wingtip. It would be the most elegant solution, but would also be expensive and time-consuming because it involves significant structural changes. So rather than lose out to Steiner and redesign an entirely new wing, Joe Sutter looked for a way to salvage the current wing. And him and his team devised a compromise. Instead of twisting the entire wing, they would only twist a portion of the wing from the outer engine to the wing tip. And a solution like this had never been tried before. It was less elegant than the full wing twist, but it would be much faster and far less expensive. Sutter and his engineers tested their new idea in the wind tunnel and realized that this partial twist was enough to make the wing flex correctly and get it to fly. So with the partial twist, Sutter and his team finally got the wing working, and there was no need for Steiner and his group of black parachutists to design a new wing or nose. Eventually, their work became redundant, and Steiner returned to the 737 project.
Good. I'm going to be honest with you. I was really rooting for Joe Sutter on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, he's challenged for control of the 747 program, but he finds a way out of it. And this partial wing twist that Sutter came up with became a legendary fix at Boeing, and it was known as the Sutter twist. But there's one problem kind of unresolved. The wind tunnel testing was not enough to confirm that the wing was no longer susceptible to flutter. That would have to wait until flight testing.
That seems very risky to me.
So our hero Joe Sutter has held off yet another challenge for control of the 747 program. Once again, Sutter focused on the big picture. Unlike Steiner, he understood that part of the goal was to deliver the airplane on time. Steiner's full wing twist, despite being a more elegant solution, was not worth the trade-off of delaying the project. Sutter has a great quote here that basically outlines his idea. He says, quote, "It seems to me essential that a project leader not fixate on one design parameter to the exclusion or detriment of others. Airplane design is the ultimate exercise in compromise. The design team's job is to define the optimal balance that yields the best results." And Stephen, as an engineer, this really resonates with me because, like we've discussed before, it's really easy as an engineer to get obsessed with the details and to kind of not see the forest for the trees. And I can imagine exactly Steiner and his group of engineers focusing on the design of this wing because they want to design the optimal, most elegant wing. But they're not seeing the bigger picture that if this plane isn't delivered on time, it's not going to matter how elegant the wing looks.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that engineers tend to fall into this sort of trap of over-optimizing something. And this kind of comes back to delivering an 80% solution is much better than taking twice as long to deliver a 95% solution.
Yeah, totally. And I think this comes back to the big theme that we've been talking about so far, that Sutter was stubborn on his vision of a safe airplane that would be delivered on time, but he was flexible on how to design the wing and ultimately succeeded by trying something new. Now, Stephen, so far we haven't talked about probably the most important part of the 747 project, the engines. So it was this new innovation in jet engine technology that made a giant jet like the 747 even possible. Going back to the C-5 program, this transport for the Air Force, the Air Force had contracted General Electric to design a revolutionary new type of jet engine, the high bypass ratio turbofan. And Juan Trippe actually learned about this new engine design, and it had been his inspiration for this giant new jet idea that became the 747. So these high bypass ratio turbofans promised to revolutionize jet travel. They're expected to be more powerful, more efficient, and quieter than the previous jet engines. For context, the 707 had the most powerful commercial jet engines at the time, producing about 15,000 pounds of thrust. But these high bypass turbofan engines promised to produce more than 40,000 pounds of thrust. And this increase in thrust means a much larger aircraft than ever before can now be built.
That's incredible. So that's almost 3 times the amount of thrust just by changing the bypass ratio. I think for context today, the most powerful high bypass ratio jet engines can produce on the order of 120,000 pounds of thrust. So that's almost a full order of magnitude more thrust than the original 707 jet engine. So it's pretty incredible how far the jet engine has come.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about how these high bypass turbofans are different from the previous turbojet engines that the 707 used. So a turbojet works by compressing air, mixing in fuel, and then feeding this fuel-air mixture into a combustion chamber. The exploding exhaust gases vent past these curved metal blades and spin a turbine shaft. That turbine shaft then spins the compressor blades at the front of the engine, pushing more air through the engine and repeating the cycle. So in this case, all incoming air is fed through the core of the engine, and the engine accelerates a small amount of air at a very high speed, kind of like starting a bike in high gear. Now a turbofan engine adds a large fan at the front of the compressor section, and in the case of the first 747s, this fan was about 8 feet in diameter. And this fan is also spun by the turbine shaft. But only a fraction of the air actually passes through the engine's core on the turbofan engine. The rest is bypassed around the core.
So this is where you get high bypass turbofan ratio. The term bypass comes from that.
Exactly. And this configuration accelerates a large amount of air at slower speeds, like starting a bike in low gear. And like you mentioned, Stephen, the bypass ratio is the ratio of air that is bypassed around the core of the engine. And in these early turbofans, 70% or more of the thrust is generated by the bypass air.
Okay, got it. So help me understand, what are the pros and cons of using turbofan over turbojet technology?
A turbofan, one of the key benefits is improved takeoff acceleration because you're accelerating a larger volume of air at a lower speed, like a bicycle in lower gear. It also provides better fuel efficiency because there's a better thrust to combustion ratio. And the turbofan engines are also quieter because the hot exhaust gases from the core are shielded by the bypass air instead of being directly exposed to the cold air beyond the engine.
To me, Will, this seems like the better engine technology for a large commercial jetliner.
Exactly. And really, the improved thrust is necessary to build a jet as big as the 747.
Now, is this going to be the first airplane to use the turbofan engine, the first commercial airplane?
Yes, and actually that's a key risk with this program because right now the high bypass turbofan is only an idea. No turbofan engine had actually been produced yet.
This seems very risky to me.
Absolutely. There's this maxim of airplane design that a new engine and a new airplane are always a bad combination. At a minimum, new engines are usually developed 1 to 2 years ahead of the airplane. That was the case in the 707. It used engines that were already developed for military aircraft. So never before in the history of commercial aviation had a new airliner been developed to use an engine that did not exist yet.
Wow, no kidding.
So a key question for Joe Sutter is, who is Boeing going to rely on to deliver this new engine? Joe Sutter considered General Electric and Pratt & Whitney as the engine suppliers. GE had been the first to develop the high bypass turbofan, and they had won the bid for the C5's engines. But the GE engines were designed for the military, and they would create more noise and pollution. More importantly, the GE engines were also designed to cruise at Mach 0.7, but the performance requirements for the 747 called for a cruise speed of Mach 0.85. So the GE engines were just not fast enough. Pratt & Whitney had been catching up to GE and were now offering a high bypass design of their own, more suited to commercial airliners. So Sutter selected the Pratt & Whitney engines because they were the only choice that could achieve the necessary cruise speed. But surprisingly, Sutter got pushback from the Boeing sales team and Pan Am. They wanted him to choose the GE engines. But as before, Sutter stubbornly insisted that the GE engines would not meet the performance requirements for the 747, and he defended his decision to select Pratt & Whitney.
I mean, if he were forced into this GE decision, this would have massive implications because there's a delta of Mach 0.15 difference in the design of the jet engine.
Yeah, so you're basically adapting an engine that was designed for one use case, a military cargo transport, and you're bolting it on to the design for a commercial aircraft. So Sutter won out, and the 747 was designed for 4 Pratt & Whitney JT9D high bypass turbofan engines. But there's still kind of this mystery of why everyone wanted Sutter to select the GE engine. And he later discovered, years later, that one of Pan Am's board members was also on the board of directors for General Electric and had lobbied Boeing to select the GE engines.
Oh, okay.
So once again, Joe Sutter had to fight off corporate politics to safeguard his vision for the ultimate passenger jet. And this is just another example of how political a major airline program can be. But eventually the 747s would also go on to use General Electric and Rolls-Royce engines, but that was much later in the program.
That's so cool. I didn't realize that the 747 basically championed the use of the turbofan engine.
So by October of 1968, the design was mostly complete and the first 747 prototype was being assembled in the new Everett factory. As they're still building the factory around them, they don't even have the roof installed yet.
Yeah, that's incredible that they're doing that.
But at this point, Boeing's finances are becoming critical. The economy was starting to dip into a recession, and sales of Boeing's existing jets had slowed. Bill Allen had begun to borrow heavily to fund the expensive 747's development, and now he needed a plane to reassure the bankers that their investment was sound. So Sutter and his team raced to get the prototype ready to show the press on rollout day. But the plane was nowhere near ready to fly yet. There were more parts on the factory floor than on the actual airplane, and several missing parts had to be faked using cardboard and silver paint. And the engines were only decorative, because Sutter had recently visited the Pratt & Whitney plant to check on the progress of the engines he had ordered, only to discover that the first stage compressor was the only portion of the design that was complete. He also uncovered that the engines had not even made a first test run yet.
Oh, wow. So is Pratt & Whitney falling behind here?
Yeah, they are. They're designing this engine from scratch, and when they signed the contract, they just had a design drawings, so they haven't even tested one yet, and we're getting perilously close to when Boeing needs to deliver the first jet, but they don't have any working engines yet.
Wow, no kidding.
And to make matters worse, during the installation of the landing gear, the plane collapsed and one of the temporary supports punched a hole in the wing. But Sutter and his team got the prototype repaired and rolled out to a huge media event in October 1968, just 1 year before it was scheduled to be delivered to Pan Am. So all the airlines who had placed orders sent flight attendants to represent them at this event, and the 747 drew the attention of the entire aviation industry from all over the world, because everyone was curious to see what the future of air travel might look like. And of course, the bankers were also happy to see that Bill Allen had a real airplane to show for all the money he had borrowed, even if it couldn't fly yet.
So to summarize, the 747 was really 3 massive programs all at once. There was building the factory, which would be the biggest building by volume in the world. There was designing the airplane, which is going to be the largest and first wide-body commercial jet ever built. And there was developing the engines, which was a new, untested, unproduced jet engine technology called the high bypass turbofan jet engine. But despite all these challenges, Sutter and his team do ultimately manage to scrape together a 747 prototype to roll out for the world to see and put Boeing's bankers at ease.
The 747 has made its first public appearance, but so far it hasn't even left the ground yet. The engines are only decorative, and the plane is actually severely overweight. So it's now a race to get the 747 off the ground and begin test flights before the first deliveries are due to Juan Trippe and Pan Am in 1 year's time. Five months after the 747's rollout, Pratt & Whitney delivered the first engines, and Sutter and his team now had a prototype that was ready to attempt its first test flight. The first flight was planned for February 9th, 1969, but there was still a lot of questions around, would this plane even fly? The media was present to cover the event, and many journalists and residents of Seattle were skeptical something as big as the 747 could actually fly. There was a lot of pressure on Bill Allen to prove his gamble on the 747 was going to pay off. So far, Sutter and his engineers had performed countless tests in the wind tunnel, but simulators at this time were not as advanced as today. There were no guarantees something wouldn't go wrong. The biggest risk was with the new prototype engines from Pratt & Whitney. There was a serious chance that an engine flameout could occur when the jet first rotated for takeoff and the angle of intake air changed. So Sutter and his team actually added 40 car batteries connected to the hydraulic pumps so the plane would still have flight controls if the engines went out. But for Sutter, this was an exciting moment. He couldn't believe that the 747 had gone from just a design study to the first test flight in only 3 years. He had committed the last 3 years of his life to the project, and now, just 30 miles from where he grew up, dreaming of one day designing a big airliner, he was about to see if all his hard work added up to a real airplane. And on the day of the test flight, Sutter dropped his wife off at the edge of the runway near the spot where the wheels were supposed to leave the ground. And as Bill Allen waited near the runway for the jet to be fueled for the test flight, he told his driver, "You see all the concrete out there, Mac? If this airplane isn't a success, there'll be grass growing up in those cracks on the apron." Just emphasizing that if this test flight doesn't go right, Boeing's probably going to go bankrupt.
Yeah. This is such a huge moment for not only Bill Allen, but Joe Sutter. I mean, it all comes down to this.
A crew of 3 were selected for the first flight: Chief Test Pilot Jack Waddell, along with a co-pilot and flight engineer. After fueling up, the massive jet taxied down to the end of the runway, where Waddell held the brakes on and throttled up the 4 JT9D turbofan engines. The most powerful engines in the world at the time sucked in air at a rate of 19,000 cubic feet per second. With the engines throttled up to takeoff thrust, the flight engineer called out, "4 stable engines." Waddell released the brakes, and the massive airplane lunged forward as the jet engines blasted air with hurricane force intensity. And one amateur photographer who had been too close to the jet blast was knocked onto his back. The 4 big jet engines whined as they accelerated the world's first wide-body jet down the runway, each engine producing more than 40,000 pounds of thrust in an attempt to lift the 500,000-pound jet into the air. As the 747 accelerated, the co-pilot called out the speed second by second. At 150 miles an hour, Waddell felt the nose lift and called for rotation as he pulled back on the yoke and committed to takeoff. At the edge of the runway, Sutter's wife watched as the jet passed through 160 miles an hour and the nose pitched further up into the air. Finally, the landing gear unstuck and the tail lifted clear of the runway. Engine power remained stable as Waddell pulled the massive aircraft into its takeoff climb. Then, the heavy wide-body miraculously transformed from a lumbering giant on the ground to a surprisingly nimble aircraft that just floated up into the sky. As the 747 cleared the ground for the first time, the hair on the back of everyone's neck stood up. The jumbo that critics said would never fly had lifted into the air and immediately validated Sutter, Allen, and his team's last 3 years of hard work. People on the ground broke out into screams, gasps, and some were even in tears. One engineer compared the feeling to the birth of his first child. But most people were just astonished that something so big could even get off the ground. The 747 seemed to defy gravity. Sutter made his way through the crowd of engineers, congratulating him, and rushed to the edge of the runway to meet his wife. She was crying, and the tears of joy spoke for both of them.
What an amazing moment for Joe Sutter. That's awesome.
Yeah, it must have felt amazing for him to have these last 3 years of hard work validated. Up in the air, Jack Waddell made a shallow left turn and circled back over the field for the press to get more photographs. As he maneuvered the jet through the turn, he was surprised by how light and nimble such a large plane could feel. Waddell radioed back to ground control saying, "The plane's flying beautifully."
Wow, what an amazing moment. How does the test flight end up going?
The first test flight was mostly a success, but Juan Trippe was not moved by the excitement of the first flight. He wanted his plane in service in less than 10 months. So Sutter and his team scrambled to kick off the test flight program and uncover what issues may be lurking in their design. Now that the first test flight has been a success, Sutter and his team have 10 months for flight testing before the end of the year delivery deadline to Juan Trippe. The team had developed a detailed test flight program that balanced the need for thorough testing with this tight deadline. And the plan called for 5 test planes flying test flights 7 days a week. At the same time, the economic recession was getting worse, and several of Boeing's military contracts were cut. One day, a vice president with a large engineering team from one of these cut programs arrived at Joe Sutter's office. He explained his team had been reassigned to develop a military-style test flight program for the 747.
Military style, we're doing commercial aircraft here.
Yeah, so there's maybe a little bit of conflict here, but the group went to work drawing up these complex plans that didn't bear any resemblance to the test flight program Sutter needed to perform for the 747. And so he realized this lengthy test program would delay the schedule. But knowing how politics work at Boeing, Sutter decided to remain calm and pick his battles this time. So eventually, after several months of work, this military test flight team presented Sutter with a thick book outlining the proposed test flight program. And Sutter, remembering to pick his battles, graciously accepted the book and placed it on his shelf, where it remained untouched for the rest of the program.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, so what I'm taking away from this is that he knew it wasn't going to work, but he didn't want to cause any trouble, so he just accepted it, and they probably thought they did a great job.
Yeah, he's basically indulging them because
Yeah.
they probably did all this work on a test flight program for a military plane that got canceled, and everybody takes pride in their work. So Sutter realized it's probably best just to let them try and do their work, make it feel like they're contributing, and then eventually they were just reassigned after they completed their job.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And Sutter hit the nail on the head again with one of his quotes. He says, "It represented a hell of a lot of wasted money and effort that Boeing could have spent better anywhere else. But if I had tried to point that out, I would only have picked a needless and unwinnable political battle." Sutter so far has mostly had to be stubborn on his vision for the program. We've talked about how stubborn he was on various crises like the wing and the double-decker idea. But sometimes you also need to be flexible and pick your battles, like Sutter showed in this incident.
Yeah, I think he made the right decision here.
And as the 747 team bounces from one crisis to the next, Stephen, I think it's interesting to look at how Sutter keeps his team motivated, especially in contrast with his management. So first, let me explain a bit about the program's management structure. Sutter was the engineering director responsible for the design of the 747, but there was this wall of middle management between him and President Bill Allen. The overall program chief was Sutter's skip-level manager, Miles Stamper. Stamper was in charge of the entire 747 program, including construction of the Everett factory, production of the aircraft, sales and marketing, and Sutter's engineering team. Now, in the areas where Stamper took an interest, things happened. He was instrumental in building the Everett factory. But the problem was he didn't take any interest in the critical design work Sutter's engineers were doing.
That's interesting. I would have expected that the design part is one of the more interesting portions of building an airplane, so it's surprising to me that this is one of the areas that he took less of an interest in.
So if you know Stamper's background, it makes a little bit more sense. He was previously a manager at General Motors before coming to Boeing, and he didn't have a background in aeronautical engineering. So he really struggled to make decisions related to the design of the airplane because it's this highly technical subject that he's not fluent in. When Sutter made presentations outlining the scale of the project, requesting more resources to meet the timeline, Stamper would just complain about these cost overruns and put off decisions. Now, to keep pace with the demanding schedule, Sutter and his team were working a lot of overtime, often 10 to 12-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. To improve morale and accelerate the design, Miles Stamper launched a motivational campaign for the project team. He named the teams working on the 747 the Incredibles and made a cartoon of the mythical lumberjack Paul Bunyan, the mascot of the program. But Sutter's team didn't like this charade. They viewed themselves as serious and practical engineers, not some silly cartoon character. And they felt the campaign implied that they were underperforming and needed to be motivated. So I think, Stephen, here is a really interesting leadership lesson. And so this is how Miles Stamper motivates his team. And my takeaway from this is that motivation and morale cannot be airdropped in. You can't plan to motivate people with cheap tricks like this. Motivation happens from the bottom up, working side by side with your team and understanding what's important to them. In this case, the engineers already took their job seriously. They just wanted to be left alone to build the plane.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that in this case, like you said, working side by side with them, touching grass with them, and understanding their problems from the bottom up is absolutely the best way to motivate them.
So then this begs the question, how do you motivate a team? And once again, I think Sutter offers a great example. In contrast to Stamper, Sutter kept morale high by leaning into the team's shared vision to build the world's greatest passenger jet. And one story from the beginning of the project really illustrates this point perfectly. As Sutter was leaving the office one day, he noticed an engineer seemed down in the dumps. The engineer admitted he thought the project they were working on was a loser compared to the SST. But Sutter took time to discuss the program with this engineer and explain the big picture. He explained how the 747 had a chance to become a great commercial success and changed the way people traveled. The engineer admitted this helped him feel better, and Sutter realized everyone on the project was so focused on their own complex and demanding problems that they were missing the forest for the trees.
He just sort of like remind them of the importance of the work that they're doing and the overall vision.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this goes back to Sutter was picked for this program by Bill Allen because he was really good at seeing the bigger picture when it came to designing an airplane.
Yes.
But now he's learning that it's also important to see the bigger picture when it comes to keeping your people motivated for the project. So Sutter resolved to keep his team as broadly informed on the big picture as he was himself. He covered the sales picture, engineering challenges and successes, and changes in the industry as a whole. And ultimately, Sutter summed this up in a quote where he said, "I saw that the role of a manager isn't simply to pass out instructions. It's also to inform. People need to know where they stand. It's a psychological necessity, and morale suffers in the absence of such knowledge."
That's a good quote. I couldn't agree more.
So ultimately, my takeaway for this, Stephen, is the best way to motivate a team is to help them see the bigger picture. Having a concrete vision for what the project is trying to accomplish and sharing this vision with your team makes people feel like they're working on something worthwhile, something bigger than themselves. And these ideas that Miles Stamper had, like cartoon mascots or mandatory pizza parties, leaving early on Friday, these are poor motivators because they don't unite the team under a shared vision. They communicate the idea that this sucks, let's just make it suck a little less, rather than this is a worthwhile goal, even if it is hard.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The word worthwhile really strikes me here. It's so true that when you lead an organization, you need to make everyone feel like they're working on and doing something worthwhile.
As Sutter and the 747 team are navigating these crises, the SST project was actually doing even worse. Total cost on the entire government-funded project had risen to $500 million. And by 1969, the SST was way over budget and way behind schedule. And everyone knows it's not a matter of if, but when the program will be canceled.
So when does it ultimately get canceled?
Eventually, it was canceled in 1971 after Congress cut funding for it. So now, the future of Boeing rests on Joe Sutter and the plane that was only supposed to be a stopgap. But an old problem is about to come back to haunt Sutter, the wing. As Joe Sutter and his team kicked off the test flight program, one of the most important concerns was flutter testing. And engineers call flutter the 7-letter F word because it can be so tricky to solve. Sutter and his team first observed flutter during the wing testing in the wind tunnel, but they had been unable to determine if the new wing had completely solved the flutter problem. And as a reminder, flutter is the condition where the vibration of one part of the plane joins with another to create these violent vibrations that can literally shake the plane apart. And flutter was actually a contributing factor in the crash of the Stratoliner that Sutter observed as a kid.
Oh, so this is really serious.
So during test flights, test pilot Jack Waddell tested for flutter by accelerating very cautiously, finding the flutter spot, and then slowing down. So it's basically this game of chicken he plays to gather data. And unfortunately, Waddell discovered severe flutter near the highest speed of 0.9 Mach. The Sutter twist had not been enough to cure the wing of flutter. Something was still causing it to vibrate out of control at these high speeds. And Stephen, now flutter is the biggest risk for the project yet. Solving it could require a complete redesign of the wing, like Jack Steiner and his black parachutist had insisted on. And the schedule also started to slip as other flight tests were delayed to solve the flutter problem. In the end, it took 6 months of meticulous testing, but Sutter and his team finally found the source of the flutter. The wings and outboard engine pods were vibrating together at the same frequency.
Oh, that's very interesting. So is that an easy fix?
So once they identify the source of the flutter, there's kind of a two-part solution. The long-term fix is to do some redesigns to the wing, but there is a short-term fix that they can implement in time for delivery to Pan Am. The short-term solution they landed on was to add 700 pounds of ballast to the outboard engine pods to counter this flutter.
What's the one-liner on what ballast is? What does that mean?
Ballast is just additional weight. So the weight of the engine pods in the wing causes it to vibrate at a specific frequency. And so by adjusting that weight, it'll vibrate at a different frequency and damp out the flutter. So the engineers are looking for a really dense material to add this weight without taking too much space in the engine pods. And their solution was to add small pellets of depleted uranium in the engine pods to change the frequency of vibration and resolve the flutter issue.
So I guess depleted uranium is very dense then.
Yes, so it's perfect for adding a lot of weight while taking up just a little bit of space. With the flutter issue now finally resolved, Sutter and his team are ready to move on to the final phase of the project, the FAA certification process. Now, the FAA is the Federal Aviation Administration, and all new aircraft must undergo a strict and lengthy certification process before they are approved to carry passengers. Now, Stephen, we've talked about how important safety was personally for Sutter after witnessing the crash of the Stratoliner as a kid. And in his autobiography, he says safety was the one issue that kept him up at night. Sutter had these 3 safety tenets that guided his decisions on the project. The first was no single failure modes. So this is basically like no single point of failure. You don't want one piece like a Jenga puzzle that could tear up the whole airplane. The second is no uninspectable limited life parts. I found this one really interesting because I guess this is very specific to airplanes, but obviously you don't want to have a part that's not able to be inspected, like it's hidden, but it's not a lifetime part. So how would you know it goes bad if you can't inspect it? And so his final tenet is redundancy.
4 engines come to mind as one of the most obvious uses of redundancy here.
Yeah, basically just adding additional systems. So if one were to fail, like the engines, you have a backup.
As I understand, I think the 747 has like 2 or 3 hydraulic systems on it.
That's a great question because one example of redundancy Sutter designed into the 747 was 4 independent hydraulic systems to ensure pilots could not lose control of the aircraft in an emergency. At the time, airliners typically only had a primary and a backup hydraulic system. But, unsurprisingly, some in Boeing's management disagreed. They believed Sutter's quadruple redundancy was overkill and only added additional weight. But Sutter was the most stubborn about safety, and he absolutely refused to compromise on this. And so one story, just to really hit home how important it was that Sutter was stubborn on the safety issue. Shortly after the 747 entered service, Pan Am Flight 845 struck the approach lights on takeoff from San Francisco Airport. The collision tore a gash through the underside of the plane, sheared off 2 of the main landing gear, and severed 3 of the hydraulic systems. But because of Sutter's 4th redundant hydraulic system, the crew was able to land safely with no loss of life.
That's incredible. Sutter's decision ultimately ends up saving hundreds of lives.
Absolutely. And it's good that Sutter is so safety conscious because there is a lot of scrutiny on the safety of the 747. Despite the initial success of the first test flight, reporters were looking for any excuse to make the first jumbo jet seem scary. The press had actually coined the term jumbo to give a name to this public fear of an airplane as large as the 747. And the press focused on the fear of having 350 or more passengers on one plane and the risk of having such a large aircraft operating at existing airports. In response to this jumbo journalism, the FAA took a tough stance on the 747. More than 200 FAA inspectors were brought in for certification.
200? That's insane.
But certification was repeatedly delayed because Boeing could not find enough working engines to get the 747 in the air. The new high bypass turbofan engines were the most critical part of the entire project. Without them, the 747 had no hope of flying. But Pratt & Whitney's decision to build the turbofan was almost as risky as Bill Allen's bet on the 747 itself. Pratt & Whitney also had to build an all-new factory just for the engines.
So Pratt & Whitney is dealing with their own 747 program of sorts.
Yes, and they're having just as much trouble as Sutter is on the actual aircraft design. The first sign of problems occurred during a static engine test on the ground. Test pilot Jack Waddell ran the engines up to full power, and instantly, one engine locked up and slammed the entire engine pod up into the wing.
What does that mean? What does it mean for it to lock up and then slam itself into the wing?
The turbine blades within the engine locked up, and the force from this lockup kind of slammed the pod up into the wing because it was torqued basically on the wing.
Oh, so it destroyed the engine.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
They're going to destroy quite a few engines before we're done here. And after an inspection on this issue, Boeing engineers realized the fan shaft had snapped and jammed in the turbine blades. When Sutter called Pratt & Whitney to explain what had happened, they were dismissive and basically said, "Yeah, we know about it. We've already redesigned the shaft and made some replacements."
I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Well, Joe Sutter doesn't like it either, because from his perspective, the faulty shaft could have killed someone on the ground or risked the airplane while it was flying. And the fact that Pratt & Whitney didn't notify him beforehand really created a loss of trust, and the relationship between Boeing and Pratt & Whitney quickly began to sour. As the 747's delivery date approached, Sutter and his team struggled to find enough working engines to keep the test prototypes flying. The main issues with the engines were surges and flameouts. The engines would work fine under constant power, but when the pilot increased or decreased power, the engines would surge and violent flameouts would occur. So to give a little bit of context here, Stephen, in a turbofan, air passes through this combination of high and low speed compressors and spinning turbine blades, and there's a risk that all these moving parts will get out of sync when the throttle is moved. If that happens, airflow will be disrupted, but fuel will continue to pour through the engine, leading to a detonation that burns up the turbine blades. And in practice, this results in an explosion with a loud bang that shakes the entire airplane and ruins the engine. And actually, during the 747's development, 87 of these multi-million-dollar engines were used for testing. 60 of them were destroyed by one problem or another.
Yeah, for me, this really highlights that these two programs, the 747 program and this turbofan engine program, are both very experimental, and they're being done in parallel, and the risks of that seem to really be coming to fruition here.
Exactly. We mentioned earlier that this was the first time ever that a commercial aircraft had been designed with an engine that did not exist yet. And so this is that reality being played out. 60 of 87 engines being destroyed.
That's insane.
They're basically disposable at that point. But engineers at Pratt & Whitney couldn't pin down the cause of these violent surges, and they missed the deadline for engine delivery to Boeing and threatened to delay the entire project. Sutter thought Pratt & Whitney didn't take the engine problems seriously, and he even suspected they would rather leave the problems to be solved by Boeing and Pan Am after delivery. But while Sutter waited for Pratt & Whitney to deliver working engines, completed 747s started rolling out of the Everett factory with no engines. Instead, 5,000-pound concrete blocks were attached under the wings to prevent the airplanes from tipping back on their tail.
So paint a picture for me here. We have at least three things happening at once here. We have the engines, we have production of the actual aircraft, and we have the FAA certification.
They're also building the factory around the production of the aircraft.
And yes, and building the factory around the production aircraft. Now, based on what you're telling me, it sounds like the factory and the production of the aircraft itself are on track. How is the FAA verification going, though?
So the FAA certification is the critical path here right now, because they can't complete the certification without these working engines, and they can't get enough working engines on their test planes to finish out the testing.
So the engine really is blocking everything.
Yeah, the engines are absolutely the bottleneck here. But there's actually another problem to add to the mix, Stephen, and this one could be existential for Boeing. The recession of the late 60s caused a drop in airline orders for even the existing jets that Boeing was selling. At the beginning of 1968, Boeing had orders for 328 aircraft worth $2.6 billion. Only 1 year later, it was down to only 164 aircraft orders.
And these are all cancellations.
Yes, because the economy is dropping, so are Boeing orders, and it's becoming an issue. To make up for the shortfall, Bill Allen borrowed more and more heavily. But the banks were getting to the point where they would have to cut Boeing off. At this point, Stephen, the $450 million in launch orders promised by one trip for the 747 were the only solution to Boeing's cash problems. But if the 747 missed its deadline by only a few months, the banks would have to stop lending and shut Boeing down. Because at this point, the company's total debt had already exceeded its net worth of $800 million. And eventually, just the value of the incomplete 747s sitting with concrete blocks under the wings also would exceed the net worth of the company. So Boeing has all of their capital tied up in these airplanes just waiting to be sold, but they're useless without engines.
This is a really amazing development in the story. Up to this point, Joe Sutter was under intense time pressure for business reasons and also perhaps legacy building reasons. But now the success of the company itself is starting to rest on Joe Sutter's shoulders. I mean, this is a truly amazing moment in the story for me.
And in the depths of these financial challenges, Bill Allen ceded his role of chief executive to his successor, Thornton Wilson, also known as T. Wilson, a former aerodynamicist at the company. But Bill Allen remained chairman and continued to advise the company.
Wait, so why did he resign as CEO? What was he?
So it's difficult to say. At this time, though, Bill Allen was getting on in age. Both him and Juan Trippe were nearing the age of retirement. Remember, this 747 was going to be their last big bet before going out. And so I get the impression that the overall financial burden for Bill Allen just became a bit too much. And maybe he rightly realized that he wasn't in a position to solve this problem, and he needed to step out of the way for someone younger to claw Boeing out of this mess. But the new president of Boeing, T. Wilson, knew that they're facing bankruptcy, and he realizes he has basically two choices. One, he could make a half-hearted attempt to cut cost, in which case he would most likely eventually be fired by the board of directors and replaced by a new president, likely one from outside the company. And Wilson worried that any external hire would just indiscriminately cut cost, including the R&D budget that he felt was so important to Boeing's success. So his second choice was to make the painful cuts himself, while ensuring some money was left to fund R&D. So Wilson gritted his teeth and decided to do the hard part himself. He started by ordering $100 million to be cut from Boeing's commercial division budget. And so began one of the darkest periods in Boeing and Seattle's history. Boeing's workforce would eventually drop from a high of 148,000 in 1968 to a low of only 53,000 in 1972.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm curious, what impacts does this ultimately have?
So interestingly, this decision actually has a huge impact on the city of Seattle. Boeing was, and still to this day, is one of the largest employers in Seattle, and at the time, their share of the local economy was 20%. So when all these employees are fired, the local economy really suffers. A lot of businesses went bankrupt, unemployment in Seattle hit 17%, and the real estate market collapsed as these laid-off employees left Seattle for jobs elsewhere. And the lowest point of this whole episode comes when one of the Seattle residents puts up this famous billboard near the Boeing airport that read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?"
Wow, that's deep. Comes off as a little sad to me, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about thousands of people losing their job and really a whole community kind of falling apart. At this point, the endless crises and threat of layoffs have taken a personal toll on Sutter and his team. Everyone on the project continued to work massive amounts of overtime, 6 to 7 days a week. Sutter personally kept a very demanding schedule to keep up with the daily demands of the project. One day, Sutter was sleep deprived and distracted as he drove to a meeting. Not paying attention, he sped through a railroad stop sign and was almost hit by an oncoming freight train. He had to hit the gas to speed through and narrowly avoid a disaster. But afterwards, he wondered how the newspapers would report his death and its impact on the project.
Well, I remember from our first episode on Deep Blue, Shu had a very similar experience where he nearly died in a car accident, and it was sort of a huge moment of reflection for him where he kind of asked himself, what's going to happen to the project? And it's kind of amazing to me that we see this pattern again with these leaders where a near-death experience, they're not thinking about the fragility of life, but rather what's going to happen to their projects. That's real passion, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. But Sutter and his team knew this relentless, hard work was the only way the 747 was going to get in the air on time and save the company.
So to kind of summarize here, the 747 finally begins the last leg of the program, which is the critical FAA certification tests. But these tests end up getting delayed, and the entire project becomes at risk because the engines just are not working. And to make matters even worse, Boeing is now in deep financial trouble. At the same time, supersonic air travel seems to be a dying dream, and the SST project is canceled. This means that Sutter and his team's work on the 747 is the only hope for Boeing to become profitable again. 747s are being produced, but they're lining up outside the Everett factory with concrete blocks under their wings because they don't have working engines to fly. So now Sutter and his team feel the pressure more than ever as the fate of the entire company rests on the success of the 747 program.
And eventually, Sutter's overworked team and Boeing's financial difficulties are going to come head to head. Before long, the layoffs will have to come for Sutter and his team. But he needs more engineers, not less, to get the 747 across the line. The resulting clash will be Sutter's biggest challenge yet. With the worsening financial troubles at Boeing, management became alarmed at the growing cost of the 747 program. At this point, it was spending $5 million a day.
Wow.
Bill Allen and T. Wilson began to question the number of engineers needed to design the 747. And they told each department head they would have to present their budget in 3 weeks with substantial cuts. Sutter's immediate manager, George Snyder, instructed him to cut 1,000 engineers to reduce cost. But Sutter only had 2,700 engineers total.
So this is like a third of his entire workforce.
Yeah, these are substantial cuts. But Sutter knows the company's finances are critical at this juncture. So he approached his engineering chiefs and asked them, "Tell me what you need to finish this airplane." But each chief showed how they were already behind schedule and actually needed more engineers to finish on time. Sutter tried to explain this to his manager, George Snyder, and his skip-level manager, Mal Stamper, ahead of this critical meeting with Allen and T. Wilson. But Sutter's managers wouldn't listen, and they just ignored the issue.
Is there a reason they're not listening to him? Do they just have a lot on their plate? This seems like a pretty serious issue he's raising, that, hey, if you want me to finish on time, we need X. And they're just kind of brushing him off. It seems like a weird...
Absolutely. But Sutter has this quote where he really describes the issues with his management chain. Quote, "I'd suspected for some time that George Snyder, his manager, wasn't communicating everything I told him to his boss, his skip-level manager. George's idea of managing was to not rock the boat or upset those above him. He felt that, given time, the situation would improve." So for me, this exactly describes probably an issue that a lot of us are familiar with, where some people, their leadership style and their response to a problem this big is just to stick their head in the sand and ignore it and hope it improves on its own.
While I think micromanagement does have its flaws, certainly, this sort of ultra hands-off, head in the sand kind of management also clearly has its flaws. And I'm worried it's foreshadowing some future management problems at Boeing.
And so this is all going to come to a head when, a week before the scheduled budget review with Allen, Bill Allen was actually planning to go out of town on a trip and wanted to have the meeting that day. So Sutter was called into the meeting on short notice with his two managers, T. Wilson, Bill Allen, and the other department heads. So we basically have the entire leadership echelon of Boeing here in this critical budget meeting. And this is a pivotal moment for Boeing because significant cuts need to be made to keep the company alive at this point. But at the same time, the 747 was Boeing's only hope of getting out of this financial mess. Sutter went into the meeting determined to tell the truth of the situation, that he couldn't afford any cuts if the 747 was to deliver on time. But he knew this direct approach may get him fired as program lead. Many times before, he'd seen people fail with their first major program, and they never got a second chance. So Stephen, just to set the stage here, Sutter's going into this really important meeting with all of the key leadership at Boeing, but because his management has become disconnected from the reality of the situation, nobody's expecting what he says next. When it comes time for Sutter to present his job cuts, he stood up and shared his headcount report. He told Bill Allen and everyone bluntly, "What this tells me is that I cannot give up any engineers. In fact, I need 800 more." And so the entire room is just silent when Sutter presents this surprising information. Bill Allen looked at Mal Stamper looked at George Snyder, and T. Wilson just blurts out, "You can't have them." And so Sutter replied to this, "I know I can't have them. I've been trying to get them for 2 years. That's why we're using overtime and working 10 hours a day." And at this point, everyone was completely silent. Bill Allen said nothing. He just stood up and left the room, and everyone else followed.
They just left the room? That's crazy.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing the same issue that Sutter had with his two managers play out at a larger scale, where the issues have become so bad at Boeing that everybody just wants to ignore them, and this meeting just dissolves without a resolution. So over the following weeks, Sutter didn't hear anything else about the engineer cuts he was supposed to make. He was really unsure of his future as engineering director at this point, but he just continued to focus on the 747's delivery. Unknown to Sutter, this meeting with Allen marked a pivotal change in the company. Until now, no one had actually communicated to Allen the scale and cost of this massive project to build the 747. Sutter's managers had been aloof and did not understand the reality of the scale of work involved in building a plane as large as the 747. They had ignorantly communicated to Allen that the project could afford to lose 1,000 engineers. But Sutter had derailed this plan and shown Allen just how disconnected management was. So after this showdown, what little influence Sutter's managers had over him has disappeared.
That's really interesting. So what was Sutter's reaction to all of this?
So I think Sutter did really well here, and he has this quote that sums up his thinking at the time that really puts it in context. He says, quote, "Real leadership means having the courage to do what you know is right. That's what I did when I refused to drop those 1,000 engineers from my program. I could have obeyed, but doing so would only have ensured my departure down the line because the 747 program would have failed." And Stephen, I love the way Sutter frames this here because he takes what could be a really difficult decision. Should I cut the engineers? Should I not? What's going to happen? And he just dramatically simplifies it into, do I want to get fired now or later? Because if I cut these engineers, the project's not going to complete on time, and I'm going to get fired then. So if I have to get fired, I may as well put my neck out now and just tell Bill Allen the reality of the situation. And ultimately, that's the best solution for not just Sutter, but the company. Because once this crisis is finally escalated to Bill Allen, he can actually do something about it before it's too late. But after this contentious meeting, Bill Allen and T. Wilson finally realized the seriousness of the problem. Sutter would eventually get the engineers he needed to finish the project. At its peak, the 747 employed more than half of the 12,000 engineers on Boeing's payroll. And to sum up this entire episode, Sutter's stubborn refusal to cut engineers from his program created a crisis in the management at Boeing. But it was a necessary crisis. Management needed a wake-up call on the reality of what was happening in the 747 program. Once the truth came out, Allen and Wilson doubled down on the 747. It was the only way to save the company. Now that Bill Allen knows how important the 747 is for saving Boeing, He realizes the engines will be the most critical part in completing the 747 and saving the company. And so, the old lawyer in Bill Allen returns. He called up Pratt & Whitney's CEO and threatened to sue them over the engine delays. This forced Pratt & Whitney to the table, and their CEO traveled to Seattle to meet with Boeing and discuss the engine problems. Test pilot Jack Waddell explained the problem with engine surges and flameouts, but Pratt & Whitney's CEO remained defiant. He basically said, "What are you complaining about? You've got 4 engines. We've got issues with single engine fighters, and you don't hear them complaining." At this point, Waddell was just pissed off, and he convinced the CEO to join him on a test flight to witness the issues firsthand. Waddell brought the plane up to cruising altitude. Then, with the CEO of Pratt & Whitney huddled in the cockpit with him, he slowly throttled one engine back. It surged and failed with a loud bang that shook the entire plane. To show that this was not unusual, Waddell pulled the throttle for a second engine. It too failed and shook the plane with another loud bang. Now there are only 2 of 4 engines left. So again, Waddell reached for the throttle of the third engine, but at this point the CEO jumped in and yells, "Stop, I get the point, we're going to fix that." So Pratt & Whitney worked on the engine problems much more seriously after this.
Yeah, that's like a hilariously dramatic way of sort of hopefully solving this engine issue once and for all.
So now, with their attention focused, Pratt & Whitney's engineers finally discovered the cause of the flameouts. Torque from the massive front fan was twisting the engine and distorting its casing from a circle to an oval. So remember, Stephen, we talked about these high bypass turbofans. The biggest new feature was a giant fan on the front. But this big fan created so much torque that it twisted the engine casing into an oval. And that caused the tips of the turbine blades to rub against the inside of the engine casing. And then the fuel-air mixture flowing through the engine would break up and explode, leading to those loud surges that Waddell and the CEO witnessed.
So when they were in the air with the CEO, those engines were gone.
Yeah, that was why it was so high stakes, because I think the 747 could limp back on one engine, but if you destroy 3 of your 4 engines, you're in a serious situation. So Pratt & Whitney named this issue with the engine's ovalization, and their solution was to stiffen the engine casing to prevent it from distorting and creating the ovalization issue. So now, with the engine issues mostly resolved, the FAA certification was completed in December of 1969, right before the deadline to deliver the first plane to Pan Am. And the entire certification process only took 10 months from start to finish. And Stephen, this was faster than any commercial jet before or since.
So that's really interesting to me, Will, that the FAA certification was done so quickly on a plane so revolutionary, so large, and so on. And I'm curious, just at a high level, Will, how did they manage to get the certification so quickly?
I think there were a few reasons for it. First, and I think most important, was we talked about how safety-focused Joe Sutter was. So during the entire certification process, I'm sure that did a lot to build trust with the FAA. And then also there weren't any major safety concerns during the flight testing. Once the engine problems were sorted out, because of Joe Sutter's focus on safety, the process went remarkably smoothly. And I think the FAA also really stepped up, and we joked earlier about they sent 200 inspectors for the certification program. That probably helped too, though, because they have so many people working on the project that they're able to run multiple tests in parallel, and so they really do a massive push here to finish up in time for the first delivery. After the FAA certification, Sutter and his team finally delivered the first 747 to Pan Am, and the inaugural flight was scheduled for January 21st, 1970. Pan Am's Clipper Young America was chosen to make the first flight from New York JFK to London Heathrow. And so this name, Stephen, Clipper Young America, we talked about how Juan Trippe treats all of his airplanes like they're these flying ocean liners, and so they all have this name, similar to how you would name a ship. This inaugural flight was a huge media event for Pan Am, and reporters were on the scene to document the first flight of a wide-body aircraft. But not everything went according to plan. The aircraft taxied out for takeoff, but then immediately had to turn around and come back to the gate due to a reported engine problem.
Not a good look for the inaugural flight.
Not at all. And the passengers had to be brought back to the terminal and they deplaned. And I don't know about you, Stephen, but I'm personally a little nervous even today when I have to deplane because of a mechanical issue. I'm wondering, is the plane safe? Are they going to get it fixed? But can you imagine for the first commercial flight of a new type of aircraft? That must have been jarring. And so there's some film from when this happened, and the reporters asked these passengers, what happened? Why did you come back? And this one woman said, they said something was burning and we had to get off. So that line actually turns out to be a little bit of a dramatization, but the real issue was wind gusts on the runway were playing havoc with these idling jet engines and preventing them from stabilizing for takeoff. Because they had solved most of the engine problems like the flameouts, but there were still some kinks that hadn't been totally sorted out. But Pan Am switched to the standby aircraft named Clipper Constitution, and 7 hours later it took off for London. Clipper Constitution made the 4,000-mile trip and safely touched down in London with no issues, delivering a record 324 passengers on a single flight. The wide-body revolution in air travel had officially begun.
Wow. So this is an amazing moment. It got off to a little bit of a rocky start, but a 747 does take off and land 4,000 miles away with no issues. This must be an incredible moment for Joe Sutter.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a glorious moment for Joe Sutter because despite the wing flutter, the political battles, corporate bureaucracy, and these engine issues, Joe Sutter has finally realized his childhood dream of building a plane that could carry passengers in safety and comfort across continents.
What an inspiring story for Joe Sutter to literally grow up with planes flying next to his house, basically, and for him to sort of realize this childhood dream by becoming the leader of the 747 program and delivering it. It's just a really inspiring story to me. I'm really curious. We have our inaugural flight of the first 747, but Boeing is in serious financial trouble. How does this all end up panning out for Boeing? Do they get a lot of orders? Do they start getting some revenue? Does this thing start to pay off?
That's a good question. So they initially got some revenue for the first deliveries to Pan Am, which staved off bankruptcy. But really, the success of the 747 was muted at first because there was this economic recession going on, and then also the oil embargo of the early 1970s. But ultimately, new 747 orders bankrolled the company and held off the threat of bankruptcy. T. Wilson's aggressive cost-cutting eventually paid off too, and by 1974, $500 million of Boeing's debt had been repaid. Also, successful new variants of the 727 and 737 jets also contributed to Boeing's comeback. By 1978, the 747 had passed the break-even point with over 400 orders placed. In recognition of the success of the 747, Boeing was awarded the 1970 Collier Trophy. And if you've never heard of the Collier Trophy, this is basically aviation's highest award, and it's the equivalent of a Nobel Prize for aviation. So in the end, Bill Allen's final gamble on the 747 paid off, even if it did drive the company to the brink of bankruptcy.
So a very positive near end to this story. We have the 747, which took years to build, was riddled with many problems, but is not only an economic success, but is also validated through the Collier Trophy. And so the rest of the aviation industry certainly also saw this as an achievement as well.
Yeah, this first flight of the 747 really was the start of the wide-body revolution, and it would change the commercial aviation industry forever.
So what ends up happening to Juan Trippe and Pan Am?
Yeah, so Juan Trippe had actually retired as chairman of Pan Am in 1968, right before the 747 delivered. But he remained a presence at Pan Am for several more years to come. And eventually he died in 1981 at the age of 81. And really, he lived to see his dream of widely available air travel for the average person become a reality with the 747. As for Pan Am, initially the 747 gave them a prestige boost and generated massive public excitement. But eventually the jet's size became a liability for them. Juan Trippe also didn't have a clear succession plan, and the company culture struggled to adapt without his forceful presence. Rising fuel prices and inflation in the 70s also hit them hard, and Pan Am had ordered 65 747s, way more than they could profitably fill with passengers. So their market share declined as smaller, long-range planes like the 767 allowed low-cost carriers to launch their own transatlantic services. And Pan Am slowly sold off assets and eventually went bankrupt and ceased operations in 1991.
There's a certain irony here that Pan Am democratizes air travel, and then they're ultimately defeated by lower-cost airlines further democratizing it.
Yeah, it's almost like Juan Trippe's vision continued, but not at Pan Am.
So what about Bill Allen? So he resigns as CEO, but what ultimately ends up being the rest of his story?
Yeah, so we mentioned he had resigned as president in 1968 and passed that role on to his successor, T. Wilson. But he became chairman of the board and kept in office at Boeing headquarters for a few more years. And he also lived long enough to see his second huge gamble pay off. The first being the 707 to win control of the jet age, and then his final gamble on the 747 was a huge success eventually for Boeing. So by the time he retired from Boeing in 1972, he had become a legend of the aviation industry. And Stephen, I think there's a story that really sums up Bill Allen's psyche and his philosophy. After the 747 program ended, Allen gave the project lead for the Everett factory a plaque with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that read, "Far better to dare mighty things than to take rank with those who live in the gray twilight that knows no victory or defeat." And Bill Allen died in 1985 at the age of 85.
So what ends up happening to our protagonist, Joe Sutter?
So Joe Sutter became one of only 2 senior leaders to work on the 747 program from beginning to end. He went on to have a successful career at Boeing. He was eventually promoted to head of the entire 747 program, and then vice president of engineering and product development for Boeing commercial aircraft. He was also later chosen by President Reagan to serve on the commission to investigate the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And on his 90th birthday, the main engineering building for Boeing Commercial Airplanes Division in Everett was renamed the Joe Sutter Building. He died in 2016 at the age of 95. It's really inspiring to me, Stephen, because after growing up watching Boeing planes from literally his backyard, he ultimately realized his childhood dream of building a passenger plane, and he lived long enough to see it change the world. And I think there's this great quote from Joe Sutter that sums up his experience on the 747. He says, quote, "Those were the happiest days of my professional life, although I probably didn't realize it at the time because we were working so darn hard."
So, Will, that's our story on how the 747 was born. But I'm really curious on what does the legacy of the 747 end up ultimately being?
Well, Stephen, there's a lot to the 747's legacy. So starting off with how it was initially received by passengers, when the 747 first entered service, passengers loved the larger cabin from the wide-body aircraft, and the 747 reintroduced many of the luxuries from the golden age of travel. 747s had 16 cabin crew per aircraft that served passengers with fresh flowers in crystal vases, wine pairings with meals, and American Airlines even had a piano in the coach area. Interior designer Milt Heinemann created a spiral staircase leading to the upper deck in the distinctive hump, and initially that area was used as a first-class lounge with couches, tables for meals, and even a cocktail bar. But the lounges didn't last too long. They were eventually transitioned to more first-class seating. The 747 was so popular, airlines created TV commercials just advertising the new jet. And celebrities toured the 747 to generate publicity. For the interior design, Milt Heinemann hired the design firm Walter Dorwin Teague and Associates. They designed the first ever overhead bins, allowing customers to bring carry-on luggage aboard for the first time, because previously planes had only had an open rack for hats and jackets.
No kidding. So prior to this, you always had to check all of your bags.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but the fact that people can bring rollerboard suitcases and that we have these overhead bins now, that was pioneered by the 747. Now, the 747 had a lower ratio of window seats because for the first time you had this large center aisle with no windows next to it. So the designers moved the galleys, lavatories, and closets away from the sidewalls where they traditionally were located and placed them between the aisles to create center islands. And this divided the interior of the 747 into these 5 rooms separated by bathrooms and galleys. And if you've flown on a wide-body aircraft, you might recognize this setup. But the designers did go a bit overboard in some cases, and I think Joe Sutter's response provides a great leadership lesson also. So for the interior lighting, the designers had created 4 separate lighting systems to create the effect of a really luxurious space. Sutter decided one of these systems needed to be removed to cut down on weight. But one particular designer was upset because he had worked so hard on perfecting the lighting system, and he even shed a few tears when Sutter said it had to go. Sutter stuck with his decision to cut the lighting system, but he made a promise. Eventually, the 747 would get more powerful engines. Then, the 4th lighting system could be added back in. Eventually, more powerful engines were added, and Sutter kept his word. I think this is another great leadership lesson from Joe Sutter here, Stephen, that rather than just saying no to an idea, you should explain your reasoning and offer a solution. Sutter knew the weight of the plane was more important than this 4th lighting system, but he also understood how important it was to the designer, who had been working just as hard on the interior lighting as the engineers were on cutting weight. Sutter made the right choice here, but also explained his reasoning and offered a solution for the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with this leadership lesson, Will. I think that Sutter's communication style here really allows the designer to make his work feel valued at the end of the day, and him keeping his word highlights that even more.
So passengers loved the new amenities on the 747, but airlines also liked them too. Once the first 747s were delivered to Pan Am, more orders quickly rolled in. International airlines felt that they had to buy 747s of their own to compete with Pan Am. And the 747 became the must-have flagship airplane for airlines. It only operated between major world cities, so having one serve your airport became a badge of honor. Also, newer airlines that were getting started thought that operating a 747 would legitimize them. Many of the first orders were to national flag carriers who cared less about profitability and more about status symbols. Because these flag carriers, Stephen, are basically government-subsidized airlines that are basically showing the flag for their country. And so they want to have this luxurious flagship airplane like the 747. And demand was so high that 92 aircraft were produced in the first year.
That's a lot. So it seems to me that the massive project to build this factory in parallel was a resounding success.
The 747 was also easy to fly and maintain for the airlines. So, Stephen, operating costs in the airline industry are very high. So small savings of 1% to 2% can mean millions of dollars for the airlines. There's this famous story that Delta Airlines removed a few peanuts from the onboard snacks and saved millions of dollars a year just by cutting down the number of peanuts.
No kidding.
But by 1990, a 747 had a seat mile operating cost 45% lower than the 707s. So we're talking about an industry where small savings of 1% to 2% can make a big difference. But the 747 was 45% cheaper to operate.
That's incredible. I was not expecting 45% lower. That's amazing.
And the 747 also became an immediate hit with flight crews. Pilots say that it flies beautifully and makes the best landings of any airplane, despite its size. And despite one trip's reluctance, the crew did finally get a rest area on the 747, though it was located above the rear galley and not in the hump. And what's really interesting to me, Stephen, is in interviews, many flight crews express this emotional attachment and love for the 747. They say that it's a plane that they always felt they could trust and rely on, and they've flown it all over the world and developed this really close emotional bond. Initially, the 747 enjoyed a market all to itself. Douglas and Lockheed had instead focused on the domestic trunk routes with the DC-10 and the L-1011. And Clive Irving highlights this when he says, quote, "The 747 had the skies to itself. By gambling on it beyond their means and surviving the gamble, Boeing had produced an airplane that was beyond the resources of any other company to compete with." The 747 has been in service for 55 years, and the secret to its years of success has been its remarkable flexibility. If you remember, Sutter and his team intentionally designed room for growth by giving it a more robust structure and bigger wings than initially needed. The 747 has been adapted to several variants over the years to meet the changing needs of airlines. So, Stephen, a few of my favorite variants. The first is the 747 SR, or short range, and this was a version developed specifically for the high-volume domestic flights in Japan.
Yeah, I think I've seen this one before. It's like very short and kind of stubby.
Yeah, and it's basically for delivering large volumes of people from one Japanese island to the next. Shortly after the passenger version was released, Boeing also released the 747-200 freighter, and this was the first cargo version of the 747. And it has become the backbone of international air freight, even to this day. One of my favorite variations is also the 747-200 Combi, and this is a combination passenger and freighter version, and this was really focused on airlines that wanted the prestige of a 747, but didn't have enough passenger demand, so they split it between passenger and freighter versions. Pan Am also worked with Boeing to develop the 747 SP for special performance. This was a shortened and lighter 747 with increased range for flying very long-haul international routes like New York to Tokyo. And then, Stephen, there's a few unique one-offs of the 747 that really just demonstrate what a flexible platform it is. NASA, for several years, used the Space Shuttle Transport version of the 747, and this was used to ferry the Space Shuttle from its landing site in California back to Cape Canaveral in Florida. And if you've ever seen a picture of this, it's really cool because they basically just mounted the Space Shuttle on the back of a 747, and it's incredible to see it flying. And then, Stephen, my personal favorite variant of the 747 is the modern-day Air Force One, or presidential transport. So when I was in the Air Force, I was actually based at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, where the 747 Air Force One operates out of. And so I got to see it all the time, coming and flying from the airfield. And it's a really unique experience because it's such an important plane that they shut down the entire base every time it comes in or leaves. And so you got to see it several times, fly in with the president come out, and it's just truly one of the most spectacular airplanes in the world.
And there's two of them, right?
And there's two of them. They operate two. Then they're basically a mobile command center for the president. So, Stephen, what is your favorite variant of the 747?
Personally, I'm a sucker for the Dash 8, the latest one. It has like these huge new modern engines. It has the biggest upper deck of any 747. And I don't know, I guess I'm a sucker for upper decks. It's unfortunate, though, it didn't have a very long run, but definitely the coolest in my opinion.
So speaking of not having a very long run, I wanted to talk a little bit about the present day economics of the 747 and what they're used for today. So as early as the 1990s, the shifting economics of the airline industry had reduced the need for these large four-engine aircraft like the 747. The 747 was initially conceived for the hub and spoke model. Now, this hub and spoke model is an airline strategy where smaller planes aggregate travelers from smaller cities into major hubs like New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and then transfer them to other hubs before finally delivering them to their destination. And you might recognize this if you live in a smaller city, have to take a flight to a larger hub like Atlanta before going on to your final destination.
And the hub and spokes model is basically where the idea of a flight connection comes from.
But in the 1990s, airlines began to shift to more point-to-point or direct flights, driven by low-cost carriers who were using new two-engine planes with improved range and fuel efficiency. And nowadays, most airlines have shifted to these two-engine wide-body jets for direct overseas flights. Two-engine airplanes like the 787 and the A350 can now make transoceanic crossings using less fuel thanks to improvements in jet engine performance and reliability. So, Stephen, this was really interesting to me. The 787 has the same range as the 747, but carries fewer people, so it can fly direct to more destinations.
Yeah, bigger airplanes are harder to fill up, and you need to fill up the airplane for it to be economical.
Also, in 2007, the 747 lost its crown as the world's largest passenger airliner to the new Airbus A380. So the A380 is a full double-decker with seating for up to 853 passengers. But the A380 also suffered from this same shifting economics as the 747, and it ended production in 2021. The final passenger version of the 747 was delivered in 2017, and the final U.S. airline flight on the 747 occurred that same year. And this is really interesting to me, Stephen, and goes back to this idea of how emotionally attached people were to this airplane. The last U.S. flight on a 747 was actually televised and covered live on TV. You can go back and watch it. People are really sad. People are crying and were really emotional to see the last trip on such an iconic airplane. The final freighter version of the 747 was delivered in 2023, and no 747s are currently in production. But 747s continue to operate today, mostly as freighters, but with some overseas airlines still operating passenger versions. But the final legacy of the 747 was the democratization of air travel. It continued the trend the 707 had started of shrinking the world by dramatically reducing ticket prices and making air travel safer and more comfortable. In 1958, fewer than 1 in 10 U.S. adults had been on an airplane. But by the mid-70s, that number was 5 in 10, and today it is 9 in 10.
That's an amazing statistic. I mean, that is truly the democratization of airplanes.
Yeah, that explains the entire story right there.
Yeah.
Even more than the 707, the 747 dramatically reduced seat mile cost and lowered ticket prices. So to have a comparison, in 1960, flying from New York to London on a 707, you would pay about $4,500 in $25. And so that's not completely unreasonable, but that's very expensive for a transatlantic flight. Today, flying on a modern 787 jetliner, you would pay about $700 and could maybe even find a cheaper ticket. This really hits home to me, Stephen, that now everyone is part of the exclusive jet set, and a middle-class family can go on a European vacation because it's so cheap to fly. So Juan Tripp's vision of widely available air travel for the average person was finally realized. And after the 747's first commercial flight, the New York Times wrote, quote, "The 747 will make it possible for more and more people to discover what their neighbors are like on the other side of the world." Juan Tripp and Bill Allen's gamble on first the 707 and then the 747, combined with the intelligence and hard work of Joe Sutter and everyone at Boeing, revolutionized the way we travel and has made for a more peaceful and prosperous world. Now, this is the part of the show where we break down some of the themes and takeaways from the story. Stephen, the biggest takeaway from this story for me was this tension between accomplishing something great and the large organization you sometimes need to do it. Some big projects, like the 747, just can't be accomplished by small teams. These huge projects require thousands of people, these giant factories, and billions of dollars. But this inherently creates a problem of trying to manage so many moving parts. I see a few solutions for this problem. The first, interestingly, I think, is something that one of Boeing's competitors did, and that's the Lockheed Skunk Works. Lockheed had this separate team called the Skunk Works that was basically an elite unit of engineers within the larger company that was able to separate the bureaucracy out so they could be more agile and effective. And this is where a lot of the most successful planes like the SR-71 and the F-117 stealth fighter came from. And really the key change here for Lockheed was they had this separate unit that could be agile and effective, but also had access to the financial, manpower, and other resources of the larger company. IBM also did this with their original IBM PC. They created a small specialized division to build this new product where they would be insulated from the bureaucracy of the larger organization, but also have the necessary resources to accomplish a large project like this. So I think that's one solution. I think the second solution, and what we saw here with Joe Sutter, was you need to have a leader who can navigate the bureaucracy and someone who is stubborn on their vision, but flexible on the details. And I'd like to dive a bit deeper into this because it's really interesting to me. If you're the leader of the entire organization, like Bill Allen, for example, you have one set of tools at your disposal, and you have the authority to really change the organization however you want to solve this problem. But if you're not the head of the organization and you're just a leader within the company who's still responsible for making the project happen, this to me is where Joe Sutter is instructive, because he shows how remaining stubborn but flexible can lead to success, even if you don't have the wide-ranging authority like Bill Allen to reconstruct the entire organization just how you'd like it. So I wanted to break down examples of how Joe Sutter is stubborn and how that helps him lead the project to success, but then also some examples when he decides he needs to be more flexible. So the best examples of Joe Sutter being stubborn on his vision were his focus on the safety, performance, and delivery of the 747 above all else. And really for me, this was key because the 747 was not guaranteed to be a success. There were so many factors pushing against it to make this plane not fly. And he had to stand up multiple times to Juan Tripp's pressure to make it a double-decker, to the episode when management wanted to put the factory in California. And then ultimately this all culminated with pressure for him to cut 1,000 engineers from his program because of the financial difficulties at Boeing. But ultimately, Joe Sutter was stubborn in his vision of delivering the project. And I think it was only Joe Sutter's stubbornness that eventually made the 747 a reality.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this kind of takes me back to when Joe Sutter was pressed to cut many of his engineers. And in his mind, he thought to himself, I can either get fired now and refuse to do this, or I can get fired later because the program will get delayed and I'll be held responsible for that. And I thought it was interesting how he kind of justifies his stubbornness through that sort of framework of getting fired now or fired later. Picking when to be stubborn and when to be flexible is absolutely a huge part of his leadership here and ultimately led to a lot of the success on this project.
Yeah, and I think the episode when Joe Sutter was asked to cut all these engineers from his team really shows the most extreme example of how stubborn he was, because he was so stubborn about delivering the project and completing it that he was willing to risk his own job. But in addition to being stubborn, Joe Sutter also showed remarkable flexibility when that's what the project called for. And we saw this at the very beginning when he had to overcome the challenges of being a low priority program at Boeing. It'd be easy just to say that, well, we don't have the right facilities, we don't have the right people, there's no way we could make this incredible airplane a reality. But Joe Sutter was flexible on that. And we also saw this during the military-style test flight program when this group of engineers came in to design a test flight program that didn't meet the needs of the 747 and would compromise the project. Joe Sutter here was flexible, and he didn't pick needless political battles just for the sake of his ego. So, Stephen, what these examples show me is that for a project like the 747, the only way it was going to become a reality was if you had a leader like Joe Sutter who was stubborn on the vision but flexible on the details.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more, Will. And I think from his stubbornness, this kind of leads me to another sort of theme or characteristic of his, and that is sort of his ability to establish his authority or leadership of the project. During the 747 project, there were sort of multiple crises of leadership, at least from Joe Sutter's perspective, from the double-decker versus wide-body sort of rogue engineer takeover to the design of the wing where Jack Steiner brought in a bunch of his engineers. And so in each of these instances, Joe Sutter, he's trying to just build the airplane and make it work, but he also has to fight this branch of bureaucracy. And I feel like his stubbornness really aided him. And the example that comes clearest to mind for me is during the double-decker versus wide-body issue, he went directly to CEO Bill Allen and he basically said, make me the clear leader of this project or I walk.
Yeah, those are great points, Stephen. And what stands out to me is I think the stubbornness helped to contribute to Joe Sutter's confidence on the project. And I think for a project like this, you need a confident leader because none of these decisions were clear-cut or easy. But I think it's important that Joe Sutter, he did all the due diligence, he did all the background work to understand what the best decision was. And once he knew what the best outcome was, he was confident in his decision and stubborn in it. And I think that's really important for projecting to management, but also to his own team, that this is a leader we can follow because he's confident in his decisions. And someone who has a good idea, like the wide body instead of the double decker, even if it's a good idea, if you're not confident in how you project that idea, people aren't going to rally around it and it's not going to become implemented.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this confidence that Joe Sutter kind of has, I think was so important to the program. I mean, in the early days of the 747, things were not looking great. And Joe Sutter kind of knew that. But despite that, he kind of projected this confidence on the program, and that was so important because as a leader, if you're not confident that this thing is going to succeed, that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy and could have ended the 747 program early on.
Yeah, that's a great point, Stephen, and something I'd like to explore on future episodes. Now, Stephen, something that really stuck out to me as I was thinking about the 707 episode we did, the 747 episode, and common themes across this entire story. In just 20 years or so, the entire aviation industry was completely upended, first by the introduction of new jet engines, and then by this idea for the wide-body jet. And it's interesting to me that it's just these 20 years or so, initially at the start of the jet age, that have had an outsized impact and really set the tone for air travel as we know it today. I think there was probably more change and disruption in these initial 20 years than there have been in the 50 years or so since then. And to me, this reinforces an idea that pioneers of a new technology are the ones to set the paradigm for years to come. Reading the stories about Joe Sutter, Bill Allen, and Juan Trippe, it really stuck out to me that this beginning of the jet age was truly a unique time and place. Most jets followed the design of the 707, and the only exception to that really is modern-day wide bodies, which mostly follow the design of the 747. So it's incredible to me that just two airplane designs created by a handful of engineers at Boeing really set the paradigm for aviation as we know it today. And I think we can also see this in other industries where the pioneers of a new technology are the ones to set the paradigm for years to come. To me, all smartphones look like an iPhone now. The Jeep Wrangler set the archetype for what a rugged off-road vehicle should look like. And Windows 95 established the modern desktop computer experience that we all know. So it's really interesting to me that when a new technology like the jet engine comes out, the first people to create something new with it have an outsized amount of influence that determines what this technology is going to look like for years to come. And I think we even see something similar with the advances in artificial intelligence today, but we're just at the cusp of this new paradigm. And it's really exciting to me to think about these initial ideas and designs that researchers have for what AI looks like today is going to set the stage for potentially the next 40 to 50 years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that there's this pattern. I almost wonder if there's like a lesson here. If we know that, for example, AI today, maybe the next 10 years, 20 tops, let's say, are going to be primary innovative years, maybe we should spend more time inventing and less time incrementing.
Yeah, I don't think we should discount all the what I'd call like evolutionary work that people have done, because there have been a lot of advances in jet technology even since the 747, and that requires a lot of thoughtful, very intelligent engineers to make those changes. I think the point here, though, is that the gains are incrementally less and less. So for me, the takeaway is that if you want to work on something transformative and something that has an outsized impact, you want to be working on an industry that's relatively new, that hasn't been defined yet. I think if you go into commercial aviation today and you're trying to work at Boeing or Lockheed and just build the next generation passenger airliner, you're not going to have the opportunity to have an outsized impact and create a new paradigm like you might if you're working in a new field that hasn't been defined yet, like AI or some other less developed field.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I like that a lot.
So, Stephen, any other thoughts?
No, I think that pretty much covers all the takeaways I had from today's story.
So, Stephen, after listening to this entire story, what can't you stop thinking about?
I don't know about you, Will, but what really strikes me about this story and what I kind of can't stop thinking about is putting the right leaders in the right places. And I think that Joe Sutter was a great example of the right leader put in the right place. He was obviously very technically competent. He was very passionate about the program. He displayed a lot of confidence and sort of motivated his engineers. He had this surprising ability to sort of navigate the bureaucracy, which was very important in this story. And then to your earlier points, he had this incredible stubbornness paired with flexibility that ultimately drove the 747 program to success. So Joe Sutter was the right leader for this project. And to me, this just kind of underscores how important the right leadership is. And so I'm really excited to continue to explore how leaders end up in the right places.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. What about you, Will? What can't you stop thinking about from the 747 story?
For me, it's similar to your point. Joe Sutter was such a great leader, and it really surprised me that I'd never heard of him before. I feel like there should be a movie made about Joe Sutter or something, because he really was objectively a great leader, but also the right leader for this project. And I think you could make a very strong argument that without Joe Sutter, the 747 wouldn't be a reality. And to me, it's really interesting the leadership lessons that we can learn from Joe Sutter. And so I put together the 5 most impactful leadership lessons for me from this entire story. The first is to never take the initial design configuration as a given. We saw this first with Joe Sutter's approach to designing the engines for the 737, and then also during the double-decker versus wide-body debate, when he really approached these problems from first principles rather than just using the accepted knowledge at the time. The second is don't fixate on one idea to the detriment of all others. And for me, this was really shown during the story of the wing when he developed the Sutter twist and really prioritized the overall project, including the timeline, over just one optimization on the wing. And really, this was summed up in the quote where he talks about don't miss the forest for the trees and understand all the aspects important in delivering the projects. And this leads into the third point too, where Sutter generalized this for leadership, and he said, keep your team as broadly informed as you are. And it's this idea of communicating the big picture to your team. And Sutter demonstrated this lesson when he talked about the role of a manager isn't simply to pass out instructions, but it's also to inform your people. My fourth leadership lesson from Sutter is don't just say no to an idea. Instead, explain your reasoning and offer a solution. And this was demonstrated during Sutter's approach to the fourth lighting system on the 747. He understood that everyone wants to feel like their work matters, but sometimes compromises need to be made. But instead of just saying no to an idea, he explained his reasoning and offered a solution for the future. And my final lesson from Joe Sutter is to have the courage to stick to your vision. We saw time and time again that Joe Sutter had the courage to do what was right for the project rather than just what was best for his career. Most obviously when he was asked to cut 1,000 engineers, but despite pressure from management, he stood up for the overall goals of the project. And for me, Stephen, these 5 leadership principles from Joe Sutter just really summarize that Joe Sutter is the type of leader I hope to be. He's an engineer who's technical enough to know the details of his project, but well-rounded enough to also never lose sight of the big picture. And this is exactly the type of leader you need to accomplish a world-changing project.
That's it for our episode on the Queen of the Skies, the Boeing 747. If you haven't listened to our previous episode on the Boeing 707, we highly recommend you check it out.
If you want to know every time we release a new episode, join our email list using the link in the show notes. That's also where we share corrections, bonus material that didn't make it into the show, and a hint at what the next episode will be.
And if you'd like to hear more stories from Project Blueprint, help us grow by sharing with a friend who enjoys technology, leadership, or a good story.
We'd also love to hear from you. Click the survey link in the show notes to share your feedback or episode ideas.
Thanks for listening to Project Blueprint. We'll see you next time.